Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the most brutally uncomfortable questions from history. Not the battles, not the generals, but something far more basic. How do you actually fall asleep when the world around you is made of ice, explosions and misery? We're going to the Eastern Front of World War II, the place where cold didn't just sting, it killed. Forget the images of tanks rolling and flags waving. We're talking about the nights, the hours between fighting, the moments when German soldiers tried to close their eyes and not freeze to death before the sun came up. Before we get into it, take a moment to get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, adjust your blanket, and let yourself settle. If you enjoy these slow walks through history, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right for you. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what the weather's like tonight in your part of the world. It's always fascinating to see how far this little community stretches. Now, imagine it. The year is 1942. You've been pushed deep into Soviet territory. The snow outside your position never seems to stop falling. The wind cuts like a knife, and the temperature drops so low that even your breath feels like shards of glass in your throat. The war is brutal, yes, but so is something far more mundane. Bedtime. You're not crawling into a warm mattress with heavy quilts. You're trying to convince your body that a frozen hole in the ground is good enough to keep you alive until morning. And tonight, we're going to find out exactly what that was like. You open your eyes, and for a brief second, you don't know where you are. Then it hits you. You're not in a bedroom, not even close. You're in a trench on the Eastern Front. The year is 1942, and the world is a frozen wasteland. The first sensation isn't sight, it's cold. A deep, bone-grinding cold that makes every joint in your body feel like rusted metal. You try to move, but the stiffness in your fingers and toes tells you that your body has been waging a silent war with the temperature all night. You're alive, but you're not sure how much longer that fact will hold. The ground beneath you is hard as stone. It's not dirt anymore. It's frozen earth mixed with patches of ice, pressed flat by countless soldiers before you who tried and failed to get comfortable in the same miserable position. You had no mattress, no proper bedding, nothing soft. The closest thing to a pillow is your bread bag shoved under your head, still stiff with frost from your breath during the night. The trench walls loom around you like damp, icy coffins. The wooden planks that were meant to keep the walls from collapsing have warped and cracked under endless freezing and thawing. Thin sheets of frost cling to every surface. When you breathe, the air doesn't just fog. It turns into tiny crystals that fall back down on your face. There's no alarm clock, but who needs one when the cold itself wakes you? The first awareness of morning comes not from the sun, which barely peaks above the horizon, but from the low groans and coughs of the men beside you. They sound like an orchestra of sickness. Hacking throats, wheezing lungs, muttered curses in German, sometimes in Austrian accents, sometimes Bavarian, all blending together in one chorus of misery. Everyone's skin looks grey in the weak light, lips cracked, eyes sunken. The cold hasn't just drained the colour from the world, it's drained it from the men too. Your body aches in places you didn't know existed. Every bone feels heavier than it should, every muscle tight. You didn't toss and turn in your sleep, because sleep wasn't really sleep. It was something between passing out and drifting in and out of a shallow, haunted slumber. Your dreams, if you had any, were a strange blur of warmth that vanished the moment you opened your eyes. There was no deep rest, just fragments of silence interrupted by artillery in the distance, the occasional crack of rifle fire, and the unrelenting hiss of wind sweeping across the steppe. You glance down at your uniform, the same one you've been wearing for weeks without removal. The wool is stiff with sweat and ice, crusted with dirt from days of digging and lying flat in this trench. The greatcoat on top of it is heavy, but it's never heavy enough. It clings to you like a damp animal hide, never truly drying. Your boots, those famous German jackboots, feel more like prisons for your feet. The leather is stiff, frozen solid, lined with straw that doesn't so much insulate as rot and crumble into itchy fragments against your socks. When you try to wiggle your toes, the pain shoots up your legs. You know frostbite is always waiting just beyond the edge of sensation. Next to you, another soldier stirs. He doesn't sit up right away. He just groans and curls tighter, as if hiding from the morning itself. His breath is visible in the air, puffing like smoke from a weak chimney. You hear the rustle of frozen fabric as others start to move. No one wants to rise, but no one can stay down for long. The cold forces you up like an unkind master. If you don't move, you risk freezing where you lie. You try to stretch, but the trench doesn't allow for much movement. It's narrow, cramped, muddy even when frozen, and lined with snow that has crept in during the night. The snow is everywhere, on your coat, in your hair, pressed against the wall where you leaned your shoulder. It doesn't matter how many times you brush it off. It always comes back, blown in by the wind, melting slightly from body heat, then freezing again. You feel like part of the landscape itself, half soldier, half ice sculpture. The smell is its own kind of enemy. You'd think cold would kill it, but no. The trench smells like damp wool, unwashed bodies, frozen urine, and the faint sour stench of rations that have gone bad. Mixed in, there's the iron tang of rusting weapons and the acrid whiff of gunpowder that never seems to fully leave the air. Somewhere close by, a soldier coughs up phlegm and spits into the snow. It freezes almost instantly, a disgusting little monument that will probably stay there until spring 4 months away. Privacy doesn't exist. You're shoulder to shoulder with men who haven't bathed in weeks, whose lice infestations crawl freely across uniforms and skin. At night, you scratch yourself without shame, because everyone does it. Lice live in the seams of your clothing, burrowing into every thread, biting without pause. You can feel them crawling even now, little pricks of movement under your shirt. There's no escape, no washing, no relief, only scratching and enduring. Your hands are raw, the skin is cracked, the knuckles red, the nails lined with dirt that never seems to wash out, even if you had water to spare. When you exhale and cup your hands, the warmth barely registers before the wind steals it. Gloves? Sometimes issued, often lost or worn down to nothing. Many men wrap their fingers in rags, torn from shirt or even scavenged cloth from abandoned villages. You do the same, the strips stiff and frozen, leaving your fingers clumsy but at least attached. Somewhere, further down the trench, a soldier mutters a prayer. Another curses under his breath as he pulls at his bootlaces, trying to get feeling back in his toes. The sound of boots being beaten against wooden planks echoes like a sad drumline. Everyone is fighting the same private war against frostbite, exhaustion, and despair. You think about food, but only briefly. Breakfast isn't warm or inviting here. It's whatever frozen scrap you saved from the day before. A piece of bread that has hardened to the consistency of stone. A smear of margarine if you're lucky. Maybe a strip of fat or sausage that's more rind than meat. To eat it, you have to thaw it slightly in your mouth, chewing slowly while your teeth ache from the cold. Coffee is a luxury, and when it exists, it's thin, bitter, and lukewarm by the time it reaches you. Most mornings there's nothing hot to start the day, just frozen rations shoved into your stomach to trick it into silence. You don't wash your face, you don't brush your teeth. The water, if available, is solid ice. Melting it requires a fire, and fire is dangerous. Smoke attracts attention, and attention invites artillery. So you don't risk it. You live coated in grime, with frost layering over it like a second skin. The trench itself is a nightmare, but it's also the only shelter you have. Above, the steppe stretches endlessly, flat and white, broken only by the black stumps of trees or the smoking ruins of villages. The wind sweeps across it with no mercy, rattling anything left standing, cutting through every seam of your clothing. Out there, you wouldn't last an hour at night without shelter. In here, you at least have a fighting chance, though you still wake each morning wondering if the cold has finally claimed one of the men beside you. Sometimes it does. You glance at the body of a soldier, 2 positions down. He's not moving. His face is turned toward the trench wall, eyes closed, mouth slightly open. No one says anything at first. Men just glance, then look away. After a moment, one of them nudges him. No response. Another tries again, harder this time. Still nothing. The truth settles in quietly. He froze during the night. The cold won, and his war ended in silence. There's no ceremony, no mourning, just a muttered curse, a shake of the head, and the grim knowledge that someone else will have to carry his gear. That's how your day begins. Not with warmth, not with rest, but with the brutal reminder that surviving the night doesn't mean comfort. It only means you manage to endure another round of misery, and the sun rising doesn't bring relief. It only signals the start of more suffering. The coughing continues. The boots keep stamping. Somewhere overhead, a crow circles, its call sharp and mocking. You pull your greatcoat tighter, though it does nothing, and you brace yourself for another day that will feel exactly like yesterday. The trench doesn't care. The cold doesn't care. And sleep, the fragile thing you tried to capture in the night, has left you with nothing but exhaustion layered under your uniform, like another unwanted weight. You wouldn't call it a bed. That word doesn't belong here. A bed is something with shape, something with softness, something that waits for you at the end of the day. Out here on the Eastern Front, there's no such luxury. What you have instead is whatever the ground will let you scrape together, whatever your hands can steal, and whatever your imagination is desperate enough to pretend is comfortable. The frozen trench you woke up in isn't designed for sleeping. It's designed for survival, for staying low while shells scream overhead, for giving you a chance to stay alive when the Soviets fire into the night. Sleep is an afterthought, something crammed into cracks between fighting, marching, and freezing. When your body can't fight exhaustion any longer, you collapse where you are. And where you are is never good. Straw is the closest thing to bedding you'll ever know. Not clean straw, not the kind laid fresh in a stable, but whatever could be taken from abandoned farms, from ruined barns, from carts left behind in the chaos of retreating villages. It comes damp, mouldy, often frozen into clumps. If you're lucky, it's dry for a few hours before the moisture in the air seeps in. You spread it under you in the trench, hoping it will lift your body just enough so the ice beneath doesn't steal every bit of warmth you've managed to hold. It scratches, it stinks, and it's crawling with insects. But when you're desperate enough, it feels like a gift. Most of the time, there isn't even straw. Then the bed becomes the dirt itself. Frozen mud that cracks under your weight, or thawed mud that sucks at your coat and boots. You lie on it because there's no choice. The ground is wet, uneven, littered with splinters of wood, shell fragments, sometimes even frozen blood from yesterday's fight. You shift to find a spot that doesn't jab into your ribs, but every angle hurts. You might dig into the dirt with your entrenching tool, trying to carve a shallow pit wide enough to curl in, but the earth is so hard it feels like you're scraping metal. After a few minutes, your hands are too numb to keep going, and you accept what's there. Some men sleep on doors ripped from abandoned houses, if they're lucky enough to find them. A flat piece of wood laid across the trench becomes a platform. Others scavenge horse blankets from wagons, even if they reek of animal sweat and manure. A few soldiers carry straw sacks, stuffing them with anything available: rags, grass, pine needles, even crumpled paper. Anything to make a barrier between body and ground. It doesn't matter if it's filthy or infested. The only question is, does it keep you from freezing tonight? You learn to sleep with one eye open, curled around your rifle like it's a child you're afraid will be stolen. The rifle stock digs into your side, but at least it's close. At least you know it won't be gone when you wake up. Helmets become pillows, hard and cold, pressing a rim into your skull, but still better than resting directly on the dirt. Bread bags stuffed with rations, if you still have any, are shoved under your neck, doubling as storage and support. Everything you own has two purposes: to keep you alive and to keep you from collapsing completely. The smell of your bed is another punishment. Straw that reeks of mould, cloth that reeks of sweat, dirt that reeks of waste. Trenches don't come with plumbing, and when soldiers relieve themselves close by, the earth remembers. Your nose gets used to it, or at least pretends to, but when the wind shifts just right, you gag awake in the middle of the night. There's no scented candle, no fresh air drifting through an open window. There's only the stink of men packed together, all trying to survive in the same filth. Sleep never comes easily. You lie down, your body begging for rest, but the cold gnaws at you through every layer. Your ears ring from distant artillery. You hear the rats moving along the trench wall, fearless, bold enough to scurry across your chest as you try to close your eyes. You swat them away half-heartedly, too tired to chase them. They're not afraid of you, because you're not the predator here. You're just another warm shape in the dark, another part of the scenery. Some nights, the bed is a dugout, a hole carved into the earth and reinforced with logs. It sounds better, and in some ways it is. The wind doesn't cut through as sharply, and the snow can't pile directly on top of you. But dugouts flood when the snow melts. They drip constantly, sending freezing water down the back of your neck. Inside, the air is so damp you feel like you're breathing through a wet rag. The floor is still mud, and your bed is still straw, rotting faster in the confined air. And if an artillery shell lands close, the dugout collapses, burying everyone inside in a coffin of wood and dirt. On marches, when trenches aren't an option, beds are the open ground. Fields covered in snow become your mattress. You stamp down a patch, spread your coat as wide as possible, and lie down with the stars above, and the wolves howling in the distance. The snow creeps in at your collar, down your sleeves, into your boots. You try to convince yourself that your body heat will carve out a pocket of warmth, but instead it soaks your clothes until the morning, when you rise with everything frozen solid to your skin. And then there's stealing. Soldiers take what they can from villages, blankets from houses, rugs from floors, sometimes entire mattresses dragged into trenches and cut apart to share. They're filthy, crawling with lice and reeking of smoke, but no one cares. If it's soft, if it's thick, if it promises even an hour less of shivering, it's worth the risk. You don't ask where it came from. You don't ask whose bed it used to be. You just take it, spread it on the ground, and collapse onto it as if it was silk. The reality is simple. The word bed is a memory. It belongs to another world. Here, it's whatever you can steal from the land, from the dead, or from luck itself. And even then, it's not comfort. It's survival. A soldier's bed isn't where you rest. It's where you gamble each night, hoping the cold doesn't take you before morning. You wake up, and the first thing you notice isn't just the cold. It's the weight of the same uniform glued to your skin. It's been weeks, maybe months, since you felt anything different against your body. The wool tunic, the trousers, the greatcoat, the boots, none of it has left you since you first marched east. They've become a second skin, but not the kind you'd ever want. They're heavy, stiff, and layered with dirt, sweat, and frost. You don't undress at night. You don't change in the morning. You exist inside the same shell, day after day, until you can't even remember what clean fabric feels like. The uniform was meant to be practical. Wool to trap warmth, a greatcoat to shield against the wind, jack boots to keep your feet dry. In theory, it should work. On a parade ground in the mild climate of Central Europe, it might even feel impressive, sharp, and professional. But here, in the endless Russian winter, theory doesn't matter. The wool itches constantly, rubbing against skin that hasn't seen soap in weeks. Sweat soaks through during the day when you march or dig, then freezes solid at night, turning your clothes into a stiff, icy shell. You wake with the sensation of glass shards against your skin, and when you move, the fabric cracks and crunches like frozen paper. Every seam is alive with lice. They breed in the folds of your shirt, crawl along your collar, and burrow into the stitching of your trousers. You scratch until your skin breaks, leaving raw patches and bleeding sores. It doesn't matter. Everyone is crawling, everyone is scratching. There's no shame in it because there's no escape from it. Some men burn their shirts with candles or lighters to kill the lice in the seams, watching tiny bodies pop and crackle in the flames. But the relief is temporary. Within days, sometimes hours, they're back, feasting on you again. The greatcoat is the heaviest part. Thick, grey wool, stiff from snow and frozen sweat. It drapes over you like armour, but it never feels warm enough. The collar scratches your neck, the sleeves ride up and leave your wrists bare, and the hem is constantly caked with mud and ice. You never take it off, because the moment you do, the cold slices into you like knives. It becomes part of you, a burden you carry even when you're trying to sleep, pressing down on your chest, pinning you into the dirt. Underneath your tunic is stiff. its buttons grimy and bent. The fabric is rough against your skin, chafing at your armpits and thighs. You've sweated through it countless times, but it's never been washed, so the sweat just layers itself into the wool, turning it sour and heavy. Your trousers are patched, worn thin at the knees, stained from mud and blood. When you lie down, they don't bend or stretch. They crease into your body, pressing hard lines into your flesh. The boots are their own prison. At first, they were polished leather, symbols of order and discipline. Now they're warped, soaked and cracking. The leather has frozen and thawed so many times, it feels like wood around your feet. You stuff them with straw or rags for warmth, but those freeze too, turning into frozen lumps that cut off circulation. Your socks, if you have any left, are stiff with dirt and crusted with blood blisters. Taking off your boots isn't an option. You'd never get them back on once they froze in the cold night air. So your feet stew inside them, softening with sweat during the day, freezing at night, always on the edge of frostbite. Gloves, when you have them, are fingerless, worn thin, or missing altogether. Many men wrap their hands in scraps of cloth, torn from shirts or even pages of abandoned books. The rags stiffen with ice, making your fingers clumsy and slow. Handling a rifle becomes harder each day, but bare hands in the wind means losing fingers to frostbite in minutes. So you live with the rags, numb fingers that barely feel the trigger, hands that ache constantly. Your helmet digs into your scalp, leaving a deep red line across your forehead. Beneath it, your hair is greasy, matted, and crawling with lice. It never dries, because you're always sweating under the helmet by day and freezing under it by night. You dream of taking it off, of feeling your head free for even a moment, but you can't. A soldier without a helmet is a target, and targets don't last long here. Everything you wear is saturated with the war itself. The fabric smells of smoke from burned out villages, of mud from endless trenches, of blood from wounds hastily bandaged and forgotten. You carry those smells with you everywhere, layered into your skin until they're indistinguishable from your own body. You stop noticing it after a while, because there's no clean air left to compare it to. The uniform isn't just clothing anymore. It's a reminder that you're trapped in this place, that you haven't known comfort in months. You can't peel it off. You can't escape it. It's your second skin, and it's rotting with you inside of it. Every time you lie down in the trench or curl up on a pile of straw, it wraps around you like a reminder. You're not home, you're not safe, and you're not going anywhere. You look down at your boots, and they're supposed to be the one part of your uniform that feels dependable. Sturdy leather, tall shafts, iron hobnails hammered into the soles for traction. The kind of footwear designed to march across Europe with precision. On a parade ground in Berlin, they probably looked like symbols of order and strength, polished until they gleamed. But out here, on the Eastern Front, they're nothing but heavy coffins strapped to your legs. At first glance, they're impressive. Tall, black leather jackboots, reaching almost to the knee, built from thick hide, stiff and unyielding. They were issued because leather was thought to last, to protect, to resist the wear and tear of endless marching. And for a while, on the roads through Poland or France, they did. But the Eastern Front wasn't paved roads and dry fields. It was snow that never melted, mud that swallowed whole wagons, and ice that cracked beneath every step. These boots weren't made for this, and neither were your feet. Inside them, your toes are little more than prisoners. At night, when the cold reaches its sharpest point, you curl them, trying to keep blood flowing, but the boots don't give. They're rigid, like frozen boxes. The sweat you produced during the day, when you were hauling supplies, digging trenches, or marching across fields, soaks into your socks and the lining. And when the sun sets, that sweat doesn't dry. It freezes. You feel it like daggers pressed against your skin, and the boots turn into blocks of ice you're forced to wear. Every morning, putting them on is a battle of will. You slide your feet in, wincing as the frozen leather grips like iron bands, and you wonder how long your toes will survive. Frostbite is never just a possibility. It's a constant threat. Your toes tingle, then go numb, then throb with pain so sharp you have to bite your lip to keep from groaning. You know the signs. Everyone does. Blackened skin, blisters, toes that swell until they split the leather. Some men lose toenails, some lose entire toes, and the unlucky ones lose feet altogether. There's no spare pair waiting for you in some neat pile of supplies. If your boots fail, if your feet rot inside them, you're finished. You can't march, you can't fight, you can't even stumble through the snow. Out here, that means you're left behind. You try to make adjustments. You stuff straw into the boots for insulation. At first, it seems like a clever trick. Dry straw from a barn floor, crammed into the lining, keeping out the cold. But the moment it gets wet, and it always does, the straw turns slimy, breaking down into a rotten pulp that sticks to your socks and stinks of mildew. You tear it out and replace it, but after a few days, it's clear that nothing stays dry here. Snow sneaks in at the top, melting down your leg. Mud creeps up from the sole. Your own sweat finishes the job. Others wrap their feet in rags. Torn pieces of shirts, strips of blankets, even paper stolen from houses. Anything to create another layer between flesh and leather. You see men tie old newspapers around their feet, headlines from months ago stiff with frost, crinkling with every step. Sometimes they help for a night. Sometimes they slip, bunching up and cutting off circulation until your foot goes numb in a different, more dangerous way. There's no perfect solution, only desperate improvisation. The smell inside those boots is something you can't ignore. Even in the freezing air, when most odours are muted, your boots carry a stench that follows you everywhere. Sweat that's never washed out, mixed with the sour tang of rot from damp straw, layered with the faint copper of blood from blisters rubbed raw. When you take them off, if you ever dare, the steam rises in the air, carrying a smell so thick it makes men nearby gag and laugh bitterly. But you don't laugh, because the smell is the smell of your own flesh breaking down, and there's no replacing it. Blisters form in the first weeks and never heal. The stiff leather rubs your heels, your ankles, the sides of your toes. At home you might bandage them, rest, let them close. Here they reopen every day. Each step tears them wider, until your socks stick to them and peel the skin raw. Infection waits at every corner, and you know men who've lost their legs, not to bullets, but to the festering wounds caused by boots that wouldn't give. Marches are the worst. When orders come to move, you trudge mile after mile through snow that drags at your legs. The boots grow heavier with each step, caked in ice, soles packed with snow until they feel like anvils. Every time you lift your foot, it's like lifting a stone. The iron hobnails that were supposed to give traction on dirt roads now freeze to the ground in the cold, locking you in place until you wrench your foot free. Sometimes the nails themselves frost over, becoming tiny frozen daggers that dig into the bottoms of your feet. At night, when you finally stop, you want nothing more than to pull the boots off and let your feet breathe. But you don't, because if you take them off, you might not get them back on. The leather shrinks in the cold, stiffens into shapes that refuse to bend. Soldiers talk about boots that froze so solid they had to be thawed by fire before they'd open again, and no one has time for that. So you sleep with them on, curled in the trench, your feet still trapped, sweating and freezing in the same cycle night after night. You see the tricks men invent. Some urinate into their boots before putting them on in the morning, the brief warmth enough to get their feet inside. The smell be damned. Some sleep with boots under their arms, pressed against their bodies to keep them soft enough to wear. Others steal felt boots from Russian villages. Softer, warmer, better suited to this nightmare. If they're caught, the punishment is severe, but they do it anyway, because their German-issued boots are killing them faster than any bullet. Winter isn't the only enemy. Spring brings mud, endless seas of it. Your boots sink deep, pulling at your legs until it feels like the earth itself is trying to swallow you whole. The leather soaks through, the seams burst, the soles peel away. Men lose boots in the muck, stumbling forward barefoot until someone drags them back. Others tie their boots with rope, desperate to keep them together, the leather sagging and flapping like wet paper. By the time summer comes, the boots stink of rot, the leather cracked, the seams riddled with lice and fungus. But still, they stay on your feet because there's nothing else. When you think about comfort, your mind drifts not to beds, not to blankets, but to shoes. You remember the simple feeling of dry socks, of boots that fit, of walking without pain. It seems impossible now, a dream from another life. You can't even imagine soft soles or laces that tie neatly. You only know the pinch, the ache, the constant dampness, the weight dragging at your legs. Sometimes men don't wake up because of what's happening inside their boots. Gangrene spreads silently, toes turning black, the infection creeping up the leg. By the time they collapse, it's too late. A medic will pull off the boot, the smell hitting everyone like a wall, and the man's fate is sealed. There's no proper hospital out here, no antibiotics to save him. His boots, the very things that were supposed to protect him, have become his death sentence. You know it could be you. Every time you wiggle your toes and wait for the sting of blood returning, you wonder if today is the day they don't come back. You stamp your feet against the trench boards, slap your thighs, curse under your breath. Anything to keep circulation alive. Because you know the truth. The war isn't just fought with rifles and tanks. It's fought with boots. And yours are as much an enemy as any soldier across the line. And so, every step you take is a reminder. You're not walking in sturdy leather built for glory. You're dragging coffins strapped to your feet, heavy, wet, and merciless. They'll carry you forward until they carry you no more. And when you finally fall, they'll be the last thing holding on to you, burying your feet long before the earth does the rest. You try to sleep, but the cold isn't just in the ground or in your boots. It wraps itself around you like a living thing, gnawing at every joint, creeping into your chest until your lungs rattle. What you need is insulation. something to trap even a fragment of warmth. What you have is whatever the supply system managed to throw at you before it collapsed under the sheer size of the Russian front. Blankets, coats, and anything that could be called a covering became more valuable than ammunition, because without them, men froze long before they had the chance to fire a shot. The image of a soldier with a long woolen greatcoat seems iconic. Photographs and propaganda posters showed troops buttoned up tight, collars raised high, caps pulled low, looking ready for whatever winter could bring. Reality was different. Those coats weren't endless. There weren't enough to go around, and the ones that existed were already worn thin from constant marching, dragging through mud, and doubling as blankets night after night. You never took it off, because the moment you did, the cold slammed into you like a hammer. But keeping it on didn't mean comfort. It meant layers of frozen wool clinging to your chest and shoulders, stiff and crusted with frost, smelling like sweat and mould. Blankets were worse. There were never enough, not even close. When shipments arrived, they vanished instantly, parcelled out to officers first, then to whoever shouted the loudest. You learned quickly that blankets weren't personal. They were communal, shared between 2, 3, sometimes 4 men. At night, you curled into each other under one thin piece of cloth that felt more like burlap than wool, praying your combined body heat would keep the cold at bay. It didn't. You shivered together, your breath rising in misty clouds, the blanket crackling as ice formed along its edges. By morning it was stiff, and peeling it off was like tearing apart a frozen sheet of bark. Sometimes you didn't even get that much. Sometimes you slept under your greatcoat alone, buttoned to the throat, belt cinched tight, trying to trap every ounce of heat. You pulled the collar over your face, breathed into it until the wool grew wet with condensation, then froze against your lips. You woke with your mouth stuck to the fabric, ripping skin when you pulled it away. You turned from side to side, trying to keep the cold from settling too deeply into your chest, but there was no right position. The coat weighed heavy, pressing on your ribs, stiff as armour, yet somehow thin enough that the wind still pierced straight through. There were times you had no coat, no blanket, nothing at all. Supply trains derailed, convoys bombed, warehouses looted, and suddenly men marched in summer uniforms through blizzards that dropped the temperature to 30 below. They wrapped themselves in curtains ripped from abandoned houses, rugs stolen from village floors, even wallpaper torn down and rolled into layers. Anything became a covering, no matter how absurd. You saw men wrapped in horse blankets, still stinking of manure, or in sheets of burlap scavenged from grain sacks. They wore them like cloaks, tied with string or belts, the coarse fibres cutting into their necks, but they didn't care. A scrap of rough fabric was better than bare skin in the Russian night. Those who found actual wool blankets guarded them like treasures. They folded them carefully, stuffed them into bread bags, hid them under their bodies while they slept to prevent theft. Because theft happened constantly. Men stole from each other, not out of malice, but out of desperation. A blanket left unattended was a blanket gone. Sometimes they stole from the dead, pulling coverings off frozen corpses, even if they were stiff and stained. It didn't matter. Death had already claimed its prize. The living needed warmth more. When nothing else was available, men layered themselves in newspapers. Entire issues of old propaganda sheets were stuffed inside coats, wrapped around legs, tucked into boots. The paper crinkled with every movement, turning soldiers into walking, freezing bundles of noise. But it helped a little. The thin barrier held heat in, at least for a while, until the sweat soaked through and the paper disintegrated into mush. By then it didn't matter. A few extra hours of survival was worth the noise. The shortages were constant, and they got worse with every mile the army pushed east. Supply lines stretched too far, trains bogged down, and winter arrived long before anyone was ready. Entire units went without proper winter gear, relying on captured Soviet coats and blankets instead. Those were warmer, better designed for the climate, padded with layers of felt, lined with fur. Men wore them proudly, not caring about the irony of fighting the Red Army while dressed in its uniforms. To be caught in stolen Soviet gear was risky, but the alternative was frostbite, and no one hesitated. Warmth first, loyalty second. Even officers weren't immune. They had better coats, tailored and lined, but still not enough. A fine leather trench coat looked impressive, but leather froze stiff in sub-zero weather, cracking like glass and letting the cold seep straight through. Officers huddled in dugouts under piles of blankets, just like the enlisted men, shaking and coughing through the night. Rank didn't matter when the wind howled across the steppe. The cold didn't care about insignia. You learned to sleep in shifts, huddled close, passing blankets back and forth. 2 men would lie down, while a third stood guard, stamping his feet to stay awake. After a few hours they switched, the blanket passed to the next body, still warm with the last man's heat. You got used to the smell, the dampness, the constant scratching from lice. Comfort didn't exist, only endurance. Sometimes, when blankets ran out entirely, men used each other. They slept side by side, chest to back, lined up like sardines, sharing body heat because cloth wasn't enough. Arms draped over shoulders, legs tangled together, not out of affection, but necessity. You woke with another man's breath against your neck, his sweat soaking through your coat, but you didn't complain. Without it, you might not have woken at all. And still, despite everything, men froze. You woke in the morning to find one of the figures under the blanket, stiff, unmoving, eyes wide open and rimmed with frost. His face was pale, lips blue, his body frozen in whatever position he had fallen asleep in. Sometimes you didn't even notice until hours later, when you tried to shake him awake and he didn't stir. Then the blanket was pulled away, shared among the survivors, and the body left to harden in the snow. The shortage was so severe that blankets became currency. A single heavy wool cover could be traded for food, cigarettes, even medicine. Men bartered with them, lied about having them, fought over them. Entire friendships broke apart when someone refused to share. It was survival at its most basic level, and nothing was sacred when the temperature dropped below 0. The irony was bitter. Back in Germany, warehouses were full of wool, leather, cloth. Factories churned out uniforms by the thousands. But getting them to the front was another matter. Trains derailed, roads froze solid, bridges collapsed, and everything that did make it through was devoured instantly by the sheer number of men in need. For every soldier who wrapped himself in 2 blankets, 3 more went without. For every man in a thick greatcoat, another shivered in nothing but a thin tunic and a prayer. You stopped dreaming of home, of beds, of comfort. Instead you dreamed of blankets, of warmth so heavy it pressed down on you like a shield, of coats lined with fur, of fires burning without fear of enemy artillery. You dreamed of not waking up stiff and frozen, of not peeling icy wool from your lips, of not shaking another man's shoulder only to find him gone. Those dreams kept you alive, even as the shortage continued, even as the cold stole men one by one. The reality was harsh. Blankets and coats weren't symbols of luxury. They were lifelines, as essential as bread and bullets. Without them, nights on the Eastern Front weren't just uncomfortable, they were deadly. And for too many, those nights ended in silence, their last breath frozen on the air, their last warmth stolen by the living, their last blanket passed onto someone else still fighting to survive. The earth became your bedroom, whether you wanted it or not. Out on the Eastern Front, there were no barracks waiting with neatly lined cots, no houses kept warm with tiled stoves, no bunk beds with wool blankets stacked at attention. There was only dirt, ice, and the tools you carried on your back. A soldier's bed wasn't built above the ground. It was carved into it, hacked out with entrenching tools, bare hands and desperation. If you wanted shelter, you dug it. If you wanted to survive the night, you burrowed into the frozen belly of the land like an animal. The word trench sounds almost organised, like a military plan, something structured and deliberate. In reality, it was a jagged scar across the snow. Sometimes a shallow ditch, sometimes chest high, sometimes just a hole wide enough for a body to curl in. The soil here wasn't soft. In summer, it was sticky black mud that sucked at shovels and clung to boots like glue. In winter, it froze harder than stone, so every strike of your entrenching tool sparked against the earth like metal on iron. Digging became a punishment in itself. Hours spent breaking through frozen ground just to carve out a space big enough to lie in. Hands blistered and bled. Fingers split from gripping steel in sub-zero wind. Sweat rolled down your back even as your breath turned to ice in the air. And at the end of it, what did you have? A hole. A wet, frozen hole. You crouched inside, looking at the walls pressed close on either side, damp and dripping with condensation, lined with boards scavenged from barns or ripped from abandoned houses. Those boards warped quickly, bending under the weight of snow, cracking with every frost. The dirt crumbled anyway, collapsing in chunks that fell onto your head and shoulders as you tried to sleep. Rats ran along the ledges, dropping pellets that blended into the soil. Water seeped through every seam, puddling at the bottom, so you woke with your coat frozen stiff from lying in it all night. When you called it a dugout, it sounded better. More like shelter, less like a grave. But that was the cruel trick. Dugouts weren't safety. They were traps. You spent hours digging them deeper, wider, reinforcing with logs, trying to make something resembling a room. You lined the floor with straw, or with sacks if you had them, hoping for dryness that never lasted. Inside, the air was thicker, warmer by a fraction, but also heavy with dampness. It smelled of mould, wet wool, and unwashed bodies. You huddled inside with 5, 10, maybe 20 men, pressed shoulder to shoulder, knees to knees, so close that breathing felt communal. You could hear every cough, every wheeze, every muttered curse in the dark. When someone rolled over, everyone rolled with him, the entire group shifting in a single miserable wave. The roof was always a gamble. A few logs, covered with earth, maybe snow piled high for insulation. It sagged constantly, dripping as it thawed in the day, refreezing in sharp icicles at night. You woke with drops of water hitting your face, sliding down your collar, soaking into your shirt until you shivered uncontrollably. Worse, when artillery fell, dugouts were death traps. A shell landing nearby didn't just rattle the walls, it collapsed them. Men were buried alive under tons of frozen earth, their last shouts muffled into silence within seconds. Everyone knew the risk, but no one refused the dugout, because even a dangerous hole was warmer than the open air. On better days, the dugout floor was covered with planks. On worse days, it was nothing but mud that oozed into your boots and coated your socks. You tried to scrape it off, but it hardened, cracked, and stayed with you, adding weight to every step the next morning. Sleeping on that floor meant your coat stiffened into armour by dawn, your back aching from the uneven lumps of frozen dirt. Sometimes you dug deeper, carving niches into the walls to serve as shelves or bunks. But even those niches became damp coffins, their straw bedding moulding within days. The walls sweated with condensation, dark streaks running down, soaking anything that touched them. When you dug into a slope or embankment, you thought you'd found clever shelter. The wind didn't bite as hard, and the snow built up over the entrance, sealing you in with a faint, muffled quiet. But that quiet was suffocating. The air inside grew stale, heavy with the stink of sweat and kerosene lamps, your lungs begging for fresh wind even as your body froze at the thought of leaving. You sat there, hunched, knees pulled to your chest, helmet bumping against the low roof, rifle across your lap, waiting for dawn, waiting for orders, waiting for anything to distract from the numbness creeping up your fingers. Some men dug solo holes, foxholes barely wide enough to lie in. They curled up inside, knees to chest, coat wrapped tight, trying to make themselves small. These holes offered a strange kind of privacy, but also unbearable loneliness. You lay there in the dark, hearing artillery rumble, hearing men cough in the distance, feeling the cold press against your spine, and you wondered if you'd be covered over by snow before anyone remembered where you'd been. Other times, entire units shared long dugouts, connected by narrow passages that dripped with icy water, floors slick with mud. You shuffled through in near darkness, brushing shoulders with men whose faces you couldn't even see. When you finally found a corner to collapse in, you felt like a rat in a burrow, scurrying under the earth to escape the predators above. The predators, in this case, weren't just the Soviets, but the weather itself. And yet, for all the misery, the earth was the only constant. Villages burned, wagons broke, supply lines collapsed, but the dirt was always there to dig into. You carved shelter out of it again and again, destroying your hands, ruining your shovel, and convincing yourself that this time it might feel different. It never did. Each hole looked the same, smelled the same, soaked the same. A grave disguised as a bedroom, waiting for the right shell to seal it permanently. When you slept in those dugouts, it wasn't rest. It was collapse. Your body gave in, slumping against the wall, head dropping onto another man's shoulder, hands still clutching your rifle. Dreams, if they came, were strange and brief. Snatches of warmth from another life, interrupted by the drip of water or the scuttle of rats. You woke stiff, colder than before, your body aching from the damp, your mind already dreading the next night in the same hole. Sometimes the dugout was worse than the open air. The smell, the damp, the suffocating closeness made you long for space, for wind, even for the freezing stars. Men crawled out at night just to breathe, sitting on the lip of the trench, their silhouettes black against the snow, until the cold forced them back inside. They risked sniper fire, risked shells, just to escape the stinking, steaming air of 20 bodies packed into a mud chamber. That's what shelter meant here. Not relief, but choosing which misery you preferred. The earth was both your protector and your tormentor. It shielded you from the wind, hid you from bullets, muffled you from bombs, but it also soaked you, crushed you, trapped you, and reminded you every night that you weren't meant to live like this. You were digging not just a place to sleep, but a rehearsal for your own grave. And in the back of your mind, you knew that one day, maybe soon, someone else would be digging in the same ground, not to sleep, but to bury what was left of you. When the earth was too hard to dig, when shovels bent against the frozen ground and pickaxes barely scratched the surface, men had to settle for something worse. Sometimes there was no dugout, no trench deep enough to shield you, no boards to line the walls, no logs to reinforce a roof. There was only the snow above and the canvas you carried, and that meant your shelter was a cruel joke. Thin sheets stretched against a sky that spat ice and wind, walls built from the very thing that was trying to kill you. Canvas sounds like a material with purpose, a tent waiting to be pitched, a covering designed to keep out rain and cold. In truth, it was just fabric, stretched thin, stiff with frost, riddled with holes before the season was over. Soldiers took their shelter halves, simple squares of canvas issued to each man, and tied them together, hoping 2 or 3 would create something resembling a tent. They hammered pegs into the frozen ground, or when the ground refused, they weighted the edges with stones, ice chunks, or their own gear. The result was always the same, a sagging, flimsy triangle that barely stood upright. It flapped wildly in the wind, letting snow swirl inside as easily as it stayed out. Inside, the cold was the same. The canvas did nothing to stop it. Wind tore through the seams, snow slipped under the edges, frost formed on the inner walls and dropped down onto your face in the middle of the night. You huddled close to the ground, curling into yourself, hoping your body heat would carve out a tiny pocket of warmth. It didn't. The air inside felt sharper somehow, trapped with your breath until it iced over your collar. You woke shivering harder than when you'd lain down, every exhale painting the fabric above with a thin layer of frost that later rained back down in icy dust. The snow became part of the shelter, whether you wanted it or not. You piled it against the sides of the canvas to block the wind, but by morning it had collapsed inward, burying the lower half of your body. Sometimes that was the point. Men dug shallow pits in the snow, set their canvas across the top, and crawled inside. They called them snow graves, half shelters that looked like shallow igloos without the insulation. You lay there, snow pressing against your sides, melting slowly from your body heat, then freezing again in sharp crusts. Your blanket, if you had one, became soaked. Your coat stiffened with ice. You told yourself the snow acted as insulation, that it trapped warmth. And for a moment, maybe it did. But mostly it felt like crawling into your own coffin. Sharing made it slightly better. 2 or 3 men crawled into the same space, pressed so close together that you couldn't move without elbowing someone in the ribs. You lay there, shoulder to shoulder, listening to each other's teeth chatter, feeling each other's breath freeze on your cheeks. The canvas sagged under the weight of snow, bending until it brushed your helmet, and every gust of wind rattled it so hard you wondered if it would take flight. When it collapsed, which it always did, you didn't bother rebuilding. You just dragged the fabric over your bodies like a thin, stiff blanket and prayed for morning. There were nights when you had no canvas at all. It had been lost, burned, or stolen, and you were left with nothing but the open sky. Then the snow became both mattress and blanket. You scooped out a hollow with your hands, curled into it, and covered yourself with whatever scraps you had. Some men pulled snow over their own bodies deliberately, trying to bury themselves for insulation, their forms disappearing into the white landscape. The problem came in the morning, when frost sealed them in, and they had to claw their way out, or when they didn't wake at all. Snow that promised warmth became a silent tomb, and the line between survival and suffocation blurred every night. Canvas also betrayed you in the rain. Not the heavy summer rain of Germany, but the sleet and freezing drizzle that fell endlessly in the Russian autumn. It soaked through the fabric in minutes, dripping onto your face, running down your back, soaking into your blanket until everything was heavy and slimy. You sat up in the dark, clutching your rifle, water pooling at your boots, your body shaking so hard your teeth clattered against each other. There was no escape, nowhere dry. By dawn, your canvas was plastered against the ground, mud streaking through every seam, so heavy with water that you couldn't even fold it without wringing it out first. Improvisation was constant. Men propped canvas against half-buried wagons, stretched it across trenches, tied it between skeletal trees, or draped it over frozen horses. Anything became a support structure if it held the weight for even a few hours. You crawled under, curled into yourself, and convinced your mind it was shelter. It never truly was. The wind laughed at your efforts, tearing through every seam. The snow built higher than your flimsy walls, pressing them flat. And in the morning you brushed frost from your eyebrows and pretended you'd slept, even though you'd only shivered through a long, miserable night. The worst part was the sound. Canvas in the wind was never quiet. It snapped, flapped, and rattled without pause, every gust turning it into a drum above your head. Sleep became impossible when the noise never stopped, when every crackle sounded like approaching footsteps, when every snap made you think of gunfire. You lay there, eyes open, staring at the dark, while the canvas shook itself loose and dumped a fresh load of snow into your face. The cold made men inventive. Some sewed extra layers onto their shelter halves, stitching blankets or rags to the inside. Others coated them with grease or wax, hoping to make them water resistant. A few lined the edges with straw, piling earth over the top to create a half dugout. None of it worked for long. The cold always won. The snow always broke in. The canvas always failed. And yet you clung to it. You carried that stiff square of fabric everywhere, folded and strapped to your pack, because even a useless cover was better than nothing. Without it, you were exposed entirely, forced to lie under open skies where the stars glittered above like shards of ice. You envied the ones who had dugouts, who could crawl underground and at least pretend they were safe. Out here, under canvas and snow, you felt like prey. The wind hunted you, the cold stalked you, and every night you wondered if you'd be the one frozen stiff by morning, your shelter sagging over a body that no longer breathed. Snow and canvas weren't homes. They weren't even shelter in the real sense of the word. They were makeshift covers, bandages slapped onto a wound too large to heal. You didn't rest under them. You endured. You shivered, cursed, scratched at lice, shifted in the damp, and prayed the night would end before your body did. And when the sun finally rose, pale and weak on the horizon, you dragged yourself out from under your sagging tent, shook off the ice, folded the stiff fabric, and carried it forward, knowing you'd repeat the same misery again that evening. You wanted fire more than you wanted food. The hunger gnawed, yes, but hunger didn't bite at your fingers until they cracked and bled. Hunger didn't freeze your breath into crystals that stung your lips. Fire promised warmth, a reprieve from the endless cold, something to make the night even slightly more human. But fire was also betrayal. A single flicker could give away your position. A single wisp of smoke could summon death from miles away. So every time you thought about lighting one, you hesitated. The very thing that could save you was the same thing that could kill you. The urge was constant. Your boots were blocks of ice. Your coat was stiff with frost. Your hands ached so badly you could hardly work the bolt on your rifle. The cold settled in your chest until coughing became its own rhythm, rattling in the dark like broken machinery. You dreamed of a fire. Not a big one, not even a cheerful one. Just a small flame, flickering quietly enough to thaw your fingers and melt the ice from your collar. But you knew what it meant. A fire was light, and light was a beacon. In the black fields of the steppe, where darkness stretched for miles in every direction, even a cigarette ember could be spotted from far away. Entire units learned this the hard way, cut down in their dugouts because someone wanted a moment's warmth. Smoke was the other problem. In daylight, it rose like a flag, a grey ribbon that screamed your location to every Soviet gun within range. At night, it carried the smell of burning wood, sharp and unmistakable, drifting on the wind towards anyone listening. Villages burned across the horizon all the time, so the smell was familiar. But a fresh fire meant men, and men meant targets. You tried to build them small, hidden, feeding only twigs and grass, but smoke still betrayed you. One mistake, one careless soldier tossing on a wet log, and you were back on your stomach as shells rained down. And so you learned to suffer without it. You curled into the trench, pulled your coat tight, and let your body shake until exhaustion forced sleep. You told yourself you didn't need fire, that you'd survive until morning. Some nights you did. Some nights men didn't. In the morning, you found them stiff, curled on their sides, fingers locked around rifles they'd never fire again. Fire could have saved them, but lighting one might have killed everyone else. That was the trade, and no one forgot it. Still, men tried. They always tried. In the deep woods, further from the lines, some risked small fires, burying them inside pits, covering the flames with layers of branches so no glow escaped. They dug holes into snowbanks, built fires inside, and sat hunched over the tiny heat like beggars over a coin. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the snow melted too quickly, collapsing the walls and smothering the flames. Then you were left soaked, steaming in the night air, colder than before. The wood itself betrayed you. Out here, in the endless white fields, there was almost nothing to burn. Villages had been stripped bare. Fences, doors, chairs, even icons torn from church walls. Everything that could burn was already ash. What you found was damp, half-frozen branches, rotten logs, or clumps of straw pulled from barns. You lit them with shaking hands, matches running out faster than ammunition, and they hissed more smoke than flame. Sometimes you crouched for an hour, coaxing sparks, blowing into kindling until your lips cracked, only to watch the whole thing sputter and die. and all the while the cold laughed, chewing deeper into your bones. If you were lucky enough to start one, even briefly, it became a sacred thing. Men crowded close, hands outstretched, shoulders pressed together, faces lit by the glow. You felt the sting as blood returned to your fingers, the pins and needles that made you wince but also sigh with relief. You held boots close to the flame, steam rising as ice melted, praying they'd dry enough to last another march. You thawed bread until it softened enough to chew, stirred coffee into hot water, and for one brief hour, you remembered what warmth felt like. Then someone hissed, "Put it out!" and you smothered it with snow, plunging back into the dark as the last curl of smoke drifted upward, carrying your stolen moment into the night sky. The danger wasn't only enemy artillery. Fires drew people closer, and closeness meant lice, coughing, and fights. A dozen men huddled around one flame, arguing over whose turn it was to dry socks, whose boots were closer, whose hands hovered longest. Voices rose, curses flew. Sometimes fists followed, all over a flame no bigger than a lantern. When tempers cooled, you returned to silence, but the flame always carried that tension. It was warmth, but it was also conflict. There were nights when you envied the dead villages, burned out homes, their walls collapsed, their roofs gone, but the stoves still stood. Soldiers fought over those stoves. Even without fuel, the bricks held heat if you could light something inside. A broken chair, a few floorboards, scraps of a door. Suddenly the dugout became a palace, the air heavy with smoke, but warm for the first time in weeks. You sat in front of the stove, eyes half closed, letting the heat soak into your body, knowing the next night you'd be back in the trench, staring at the dark, fingers numb. Sometimes the fires weren't yours at all. You watched the horizon glow as villages went up in flames. Entire towns burned to ash in the name of supply denial, revenge, or simple chaos. Those fires lit the night sky in shades of orange, throwing smoke so thick it blotted out stars. They were huge, visible for miles, but they weren't for you. You stood in the snow, shivering, watching roofs collapse in sparks, and you felt jealous. Even destruction looked warm compared to your own shivering misery. Men became reckless with cigarettes. A single glowing tip could be seen across a field, and everyone knew it, but they smoked anyway. The craving was stronger than fear. They cupped their hands around the ember, hiding it from the wind, but the glow still pierced the dark. More than one man died for a cigarette, shot through the head before he even finished the drag. And yet, every night, someone lit another, the smell of burning tobacco drifting through the trench, the glow of defiance shining in the blackness. You learned to build fake fires. Piles of wet straw set alight in the distance, bait for Soviet gunners, drawing artillery away from your real positions. The flames burned high, smoke rising, and you watched shells tear the ground to pieces around them. Meanwhile you sat in the dark, teeth chattering, hands stiff, wondering if the ruse would hold until dawn. Fire became not warmth, but a strategy, something calculated, a tool to be used sparingly. The irony was bitter. Fire was one of the oldest comforts known to man, something humans had depended on since caves and stone tools. And yet here, in the modern age of tanks and airplanes, it was forbidden. Technology had made warmth dangerous. Progress had turned fire into a liability. You sat there, shivering under your coat, dreaming of what your ancestors had without question. A fire that could burn without summoning shells from the horizon. The temptation never faded. Every night, as the cold pressed in, you thought about striking a match, watching the flame bloom, feeding it until it danced high. You thought about lying next to it, eyes closed, feeling warmth seep into your bones. And every night you didn't, because the risk was too high. Because the price of one man's comfort could be 12 men buried under snow and dirt. So you curled tighter, clenched your fists, and let the cold have its way with you. One more night survived without flame. It wasn't just the cold that broke you down. The cold was obvious, expected. What really gnawed at you day after day was water. Not the clean kind that comes from a tap. Not the kind you drink or splash on your face in the morning. Out here, water was your enemy, and it clung to you in every possible way. Your uniform was never dry. Not once, not fully, not even for an hour. Damp became your constant companion, soaking into your skin until you forgot what it felt like to be truly dry. At first you thought snow was harmless, powder falling gently onto your coat, brushing off with a swipe of your hand. But snow melted always. It melted in your collar, it melted in your boots, it melted down your back, and once it melted, it never dried again. The wool of your greatcoat held on to moisture like a sponge. It soaked it in, locked it there, and pressed it against your body like a second layer of cold skin. You felt it seeping down your spine as you marched, squelching in your socks as you stood guard, clinging to your thighs when you tried to sleep. Even when you shook it out, slapped it, brushed it away, the damp was still there, heavier than before. When snow wasn't melting on you, the mud was swallowing you. Spring thaw turned the ground into a swamp. You waded through muck up to your knees, sometimes up to your thighs, each step pulling at your boots until you thought you'd lose them forever. You sank into puddles that looked shallow and came out coated to the waist in filth that reeked of manure, rot, and smoke from burned villages. Your trousers grew so heavy with wet earth that walking felt like dragging sacks of grain strapped to your legs. The fabric stuck to your skin, rubbing it raw, leaving rashes that blistered and split. You couldn't peel them off, because the mud hardened as it dried, stiffening into armour that cracked with every movement. By the time you reached camp, you were already soaked in sweat beneath a layer of filth, and your body was one giant abrasion. There was no escape from it. You couldn't change into fresh clothes, because there weren't any. You had one uniform, maybe two, if luck had followed you since the supply depot, but both were already ruined. Shirts grew sour with mildew, trousers stiff with layers of caked dirt, socks stiff as boards, reeking of rot. Washing wasn't possible. Water was for drinking, not scrubbing. Even if you had enough to spare, it was often polluted, crawling with disease. And soap? That was a memory from another life. The only way to clean your clothes was to strip them off, boil them over a fire, and watch lice float to the surface. But fire was forbidden, and boiling water was a fantasy. So you wore them as they were, stiff, wet, and crawling. You tried drying them on your body, thinking your own heat might force the damp away. It didn't. It just trapped the moisture closer, turning your uniform into a steam bath that made you sweat. Then the sweat froze. Your shirt turned to ice against your chest. Your trousers stiffened into frozen tubes. Your socks froze so solid they had to be broken like kindling before you could pull them on again. You stomped your feet, slapped your arms, cursed under your breath, but nothing worked. Wet was wet, and wet meant cold. Cold meant pain. Some nights you stripped off your socks, wrung them out, and hung them near the entrance of a dugout, hoping the draft would dry them. By morning, they were still wet, only now frozen stiff, curled into shapes that resembled claws. You banged them against the ground, loosened the ice, and shoved them back onto your feet anyway. The alternative was barefoot inside boots that had their own swamp waiting. You learned quickly that comfort wasn't an option. The only choice was which kind of misery you preferred. Even your underclothes betrayed you. Thin cotton or linen, meant to be worn under wool, became damp sponges pressed against your skin. They stuck to your chest, your thighs, your groin, never letting you breathe. Chafing turned to sores. Sores turned to infections. Infections turned into another way the front could kill you without firing a shot. Some men gave up and stopped wearing underclothes altogether, going raw under their uniforms, thinking it was better than carrying wet fabric against their skin. It didn't matter. The wool itself absorbed enough sweat to do the same job, rubbing and irritating until you bled. The smell was unbearable. Damp fabric held every odour, magnifying it. Sweat, mould, mildew, the faint, sour stench of rot. It all clung to you. You couldn't escape it, because it wasn't just on your clothes. It was in your clothes. The fabric itself became a living thing, crawling with lice, carrying bacteria, fermenting like a rotten loaf of bread. You scratched constantly, nails raking red tracks across your skin, but the relief never lasted. The damp made everything worse. Lice thrived in it, breeding faster, biting harder. Your uniform wasn't clothing anymore. It was a wet, filthy nest, wrapped tight around your body. You remembered home, where clothes dried on lines in the sun, crisp and warm, folded neatly into drawers. That memory felt like something from another life, not even yours anymore. Out here, the only drying line was a rifle propped against a trench wall, your socks flapping stiff in the wind, half frozen, half damp, never usable. You pulled them down anyway, shoved them back onto your feet, and told yourself it was good enough. Rain made everything worse. It didn't just fall, it seeped. It found its way under your collar, down your back, into your sleeves, soaking you until you felt like you were drowning while standing on dry land. Your helmet collected it, dripping down your neck until you wanted to throw the damn thing into a ditch. The canvas above your head sagged under the weight of it, leaking steadily, drip after drip, onto your forehead, your nose, your lips. You couldn't stop it. You just lay there, blinking against the steady trickle, while your uniform absorbed every drop like it was determined to betray you. Even snow turned against you when it melted from your own body heat. It slid inside your boots, pooled under your thighs, seeped through every seam. You brushed it off, cursed at it, shook it from your coat, but it always came back. Every flake carried the promise of more damp, more freezing, more weight. Your coat gained pounds of water with every day, dragging at your shoulders until your back ached. You hunched under it, feeling it cling, heavy and wet, like carrying a corpse strapped to your chest. The officers told you to air out your uniforms whenever possible. Hang them, let them dry. But when was it possible? When you weren't marching, you were digging. When you weren't digging, you were fighting. When you weren't fighting, you were collapsing into whatever hole you called a bed. Airing out clothes meant standing half naked in the snow, waiting for fabric to stiffen into icy boards. No one did it. Orders like that belonged on paper, not in the mud. The longer it went on, the more your body broke under the constant damp. Feet blistered and split. Toes went black with frostbite. Skin peeled in sheets, leaving raw flesh that stung at every step. Your armpits burned from constant chafing. Your thighs rubbed until they bled. Infections bloomed, red streaks crawling up legs, pus leaking from sores that never closed. Medics could do nothing. A little iodine, a bandage, then back into the same wet uniform that caused it. It was like pouring water onto fire while still standing in gasoline. Nothing changed. There were men who grew so desperate they stripped down in trenches, throwing their uniforms onto the ground, swearing they'd rather die naked than spend another hour trapped inside damp fabric. They shivered, teeth chattering, skin pale against the snow, until someone forced the uniform back onto them. Because naked was worse. Naked meant frostbite in minutes, death in hours. Damp clothing wasn't comfort, but it was the only thin barrier left. You hated it, cursed it, clawed at it, but you needed it. And so you carried it with you, night after night, day after day, a second skin that betrayed you every time you thought about warmth. You never dried, you never breathed. You simply endured, dragging the wet weight forward, step by step, knowing tomorrow would be the same. You never really slept alone. Not once. Even if the trench was empty around you, even if the dugout was quiet, even if the man beside you was finally snoring instead of coughing, you always had company. Not the kind you wanted, not the kind you'd ever invite, but the kind that showed up unasked, crawled into your bed unannounced, and stayed until they drained every scrap of comfort out of you. Out here, your bedfellows weren't friends. They were vermin. The first were the rats. They came in endless waves, bold and fat, their bodies glistening with grease from scavenged scraps, their whiskers twitching as they moved along trench walls like they owned the place. And, in a way, they did. You were the guest here. The rats had been feasting since the first bodies were left unburied, since the first bread crust was dropped, since the first trench filled with waste. They didn't wait for you to sleep. They didn't even fear you. They scuttled across your chest in the dark, claws scratching against your greatcoat, tails flicking across your face as if you were just another obstacle in their path. You swatted at them. Everyone did. You slapped the air, muttered curses, even kicked when they crawled over your boots. But the rats didn't care. They came back, always. You lay in your dugout, eyes half open, and heard them in the corners, gnawing. Gnawing on scraps of bread, on boots left too close to the wall. Sometimes even on the bodies of men who'd frozen in the night. That sound, the steady grind of teeth on bone, stuck with you. It reminded you that if you lay still long enough, you'd become just another meal. They grew huge. Not the tiny grey things that darted through city alleys, but beasts swollen on war, big as cats, their eyes glinting in the lamplight. You could hear them fighting over food, squeals sharp in the dark, claws raking against the boards. Sometimes you woke to the weight of one on your chest, staring at you with beady eyes, as if daring you to move. You flinched, shouted, slapped it away, but another would take its place before long. Food drew them, but so did warmth. Your body heat was a magnet, and they curled near your boots, along your side, sometimes even on your stomach if you were too exhausted to kick them off. You learned not to leave rations nearby, because by morning they'd be chewed open, gnawed into mush, scattered with droppings. But even if you guarded your bread, they found something else. They always did. If rats were the visible enemy, lice were the invisible army. You felt them before you saw them. Little pinpricks on your skin. Constant itching along your collar, your waist, your thighs. You scratched until you bled, nails tearing at sores that never healed. At first you thought you could fight them, picking them from seams, crushing them between fingernails. You watched them pop, little smears left on your sleeve, and thought you'd won. But by the next day, there were more, always more. They lived in your clothes, deep in the stitching, in the folds where wool pressed tight against skin. You could burn the seams with a candle, watching the little bodies shrivel in the flame. But it didn't matter. They came back, hatched from eggs too small to see, crawling out again in the night. They moved in colonies, whole armies marching across your chest, biting at will, leaving you sleepless from the constant itch. Everyone had them. There was no shame, no surprise. You scratched openly, like a dog, hands wandering down your shirt, under your trousers, tearing at your scalp. The scratching was a rhythm of its own, the sound of soldiers in the dark, nails raking skin in unison. The bite swelled, turned red, oozed pus when scratched too long. Your body became a map of sores, a patchwork of wounds that never healed. The damp made it worse. Wet wool became paradise for lice, the moisture feeding them, the warmth of your body sustaining them. They were always there. You scratched until you bled, but it was never enough. And then there were the fleas. Less common, maybe, but just as cruel. They leapt from rats to men, from straw to skin, leaving welts that burned like fire. You slapped at them, caught nothing, cursed, and slapped again. They didn't care. They fed quickly, jumped away, came back later. The straw bedding, already damp and mouldy, was a breeding ground. You lay down at night, closed your eyes, and within minutes felt them bouncing across your legs, biting again and again until sleep was impossible. Together, rats, lice, and fleas created a kind of torment you never adjusted to. Bullets you could dodge, shells you could duck, cold you could brace against. But vermin never stopped. They were there in every moment, every bite, every scratch. You could feel them crawling even when they weren't. The phantom itch became worse than the real one. Your body tricked into thinking you were infested from head to toe. Sometimes you stripped naked in the snow, just to scratch freely, your pale skin covered in welts, your nails leaving bloody streaks down your thighs. But the moment you pulled your clothes back on, the crawling returned, real or imagined, and you were trapped again. Men joked about it, bitter humour in the dark. They called their lice their pets, scratched openly during conversations, compared bite marks like children comparing bruises. But behind the laughter was exhaustion. Lice carried disease. Typhus spread quickly in the filth, and more than one unit was gutted not by Soviet bullets, but by fever brought on by lice bites. You watched men sweat through their uniforms, shiver under blankets, eyes glazed with sickness, and you knew exactly where it had started, the seams of the very clothes you wore. The rats made disease worse. They dragged it everywhere, through their droppings, through their bites, through the corpses they feasted on. They gnawed on boots, belts, even leather straps, destroying what little you had. They chewed holes in packs, scattered your belongings, left trails of filth across everything. You cursed them, threw rocks at them, stabbed at them with bayonets when you could. Sometimes you skewered one, held it up by the tail, its body writhing. Men cheered bitterly, then skinned it, roasted it, ate it. Because meat was meat, no matter how filthy, and hunger didn't care. That was another truth. Rats became food. Desperation made everything edible. You trapped them with breadcrumbs, caught them in helmets, beat them against the trench wall. You peeled the skin back, gagged at the smell, then roasted the meat until it charred. You chewed it, greasy and stringy, trying not to think about where it had been, what it had eaten before you. Hunger was stronger than disgust, and you told yourself it was no worse than rabbit. But you knew. You always knew. The nights were never quiet. You lay there, eyes closed, and the sounds came to you. The squeaking of rats in the walls, the scratching of lice in your seams, the slap of another soldier's hand against his thigh as he tried to kill a flea. The trench was alive with it. The orchestra of Vermin, louder than the distant rumble of artillery. Sleep came in fits, broken by itching, by squeals, by the sudden scuttle of paws across your face. You woke with a start, brushed yourself off, swore, and curled tighter, knowing it would all begin again in minutes. You stopped being disgusted after a while. You stopped flinching when rats brushed your side, stopped panicking at every itch. It became normal, part of life. Your body was just another ecosystem now, a host for things that would outlive you, a warm patch in the middle of a frozen wasteland. You didn't fight them. You endured them the way you endured everything else. But in quiet moments, when the lice were biting hardest, when the rats squealed loudest, you thought about home. You thought about clean sheets, tucked tight, about clothes that smelled of soap, pressed and folded, about nights when the only sound in the room was the tick of a clock, not the gnawing of vermin. Those memories felt like lies now, fantasies your body no longer believed. You scratched, swatted, cursed, and laughed bitterly with the others, because there was nothing else to do. Out here, your bedfellows weren't your comrades. They were the crawling, gnawing things that shared every night with you, and they never left. Sometimes you didn't sleep in the ground at all. Sometimes your bed wasn't dirt or straw or snow, but steel. The army moved on machines as much as on feet, and those machines became homes when there was nowhere else to go. Trucks, half-tracks, tanks. They weren't designed for comfort, not even close, but when you were exhausted enough, you crawled inside anyway. You told yourself it was shelter, a roof against the snow, a barrier against the wind. In reality, it was just another kind of coffin, this one made of iron instead of earth. The trucks were the most common. They were everywhere, hauling supplies, dragging men from one frozen field to another. Canvas backs stretched over metal frames, benches bolted along the sides, wheels sunk half the time in mud or snow. At night, when the convoy stopped or broke down, men climbed into the back and tried to sleep. You sat shoulder to shoulder, knees knocking against each other, rifles across laps, canvas rattling in the wind. The cold cut through anyway. The canvas flapped loose, snow blew in at the seams. Frost formed on the inside until every breath coated the walls with ice. The benches were hard, narrow, and left your legs numb within an hour. If you wanted to lie down, you curled on the floor, pressed against boots and gear, your face inches from muddy boards. The smell was unbearable, fuel, sweat, damp wool, and the faint, constant reek of exhaust that clung to every part of the truck. In summer, it was no better. The canvas trapped heat, turning the truck into an oven. You lay there drenched in sweat, the air thick and sour. your uniform plastered to your body. Mosquitoes swarmed through gaps, whining in your ears, biting every inch of exposed skin. You swatted until your hands ached, then gave up, letting them feed while you tried to drift off. There was no such thing as rest. There was only a different kind of misery. Half-tracks were similar, only noisier. Steel hulls rattled with every movement, the floor vibrating from the engine even after it shut off. Metal surfaces cold enough to burn skin. You stretched out on them anyway, arms folded under your head, legs bent awkwardly against walls. When the engine was warm, you pressed yourself against it, soaking in the heat until it faded, leaving you shivering again. The smell of oil and grease hung heavy, mixing with the stink of bodies packed too close. You told yourself it was better than lying in the mud, but after an hour of coughing from the fumes, you weren't so sure. And then there were the tanks. Sleeping inside one was like trying to sleep in a furnace made of iron and noise. The interior was cramped, every inch filled with machinery, shells, tools, and sharp corners that jabbed your ribs when you shifted. You climbed in through the hatch, dropped onto the hard steel floor, and curled into whatever space you could find. Sometimes that meant lying on top of ammunition, sometimes wedging yourself between gearboxes and radio sets, sometimes crouching on the turret ring with your knees tucked to your chest. Your helmet clanged against the metal every time you moved. Your breath condensed instantly, dripping from the ceiling, falling back onto your face in cold drops. The air inside was stifling. Even when the engine was off, the smell of fuel and oil never left. You inhaled it with every breath until your head spun and your stomach turned. Men vomited inside, wiped it away with rags, and kept lying there anyway, too tired to care. The heat from the engine lingered for a while, turning the interior into a sauna. You peeled off gloves, unbuttoned your coat, let the sweat soak through your shirt. Then the heat faded, and the steel turned cold again, freezing under your body, leaching away whatever warmth was left. Noise was constant. Outside, artillery rumbled. Inside, steel pinged and creaked as it cooled, every sound amplified by the hollow shell. You could hear your comrades breathing, snoring, shifting. Every cough echoed off the walls until it rattled in your skull. There was no silence, no peace, only a metallic ringing that never ended. You never stretched out fully. There wasn't space. You curled, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around yourself, back pressed against some unyielding corner. You shifted constantly, chasing comfort that didn't exist. One position left your neck stiff, another left your legs numb, another pressed some sharp edge into your ribs. You rotated through them all, over and over, until exhaustion forced you still. Even then, sleep was shallow. The moment someone moved, the whole tank echoed with it. The moment someone coughed, you woke again. Sometimes you shared the tank with 4 or 5 other men. You packed into it like sardines, legs tangled, shoulders jammed together, helmets clattering as you tried to find space. You breathed the same stale air, felt the same condensation dripping on your faces. If someone shifted, everyone else shifted with him, the whole group rocking as if the machine were alive. You woke with another man's arm across your chest, his breath hot on your ear, his boot pressed into your ribs. There was no privacy, no space, just bodies in steel trying not to suffocate each other. The trucks weren't much better in that regard. Men piled in, collapsing onto benches, leaning against each other until they slumped like sacks of grain. Heads rested on shoulders, arms draped across laps, boots pressed against thighs. You woke with a stiff neck, someone's chin digging into your collar, your own head resting awkwardly against a rifle butt. If someone shifted in his sleep, the whole row toppled like dominoes. One man after another jolted awake. No one laughed, no one complained. You were too tired for that. And yet, despite the discomfort, despite the stink, despite the noise, you still envied those moments, because steel meant shelter. Trucks had roofs, tanks had armour. Snow stayed outside, rain beat on canvas instead of your back. Wind rattled metal instead of slicing through your coat. You were still miserable, but you were miserable under cover, and sometimes that was enough. The worst was when you had to move in the middle of the night. Orders barked, engines roared, men scrambled back into their places. You tried to sleep through the jolting ride, head banging against metal, body tossed with every rut and pothole. The wheels clattered, the tracks groaned, and your teeth rattled with the vibration. You dozed in snatches, head lolling forward, waking every few minutes when your chin smacked your chest. You dreamed of silence, of stillness, but the road never gave it to you. Fuel shortages made it worse. Trucks stalled in fields, tanks ran dry miles from the front. You were ordered to sleep inside anyway, the machines frozen where they stopped. You climbed into them, curled on the cold steel, and wondered if they'd ever move again. Sometimes they didn't. Abandoned vehicles dotted the landscape, black shapes half buried in snow, their hulks filled with frozen corpses who'd chosen steel over dirt for their last night. The smell of fuel stayed with you, clinging to your clothes, seeping into your skin. You carried it everywhere, a constant reminder of nights spent in the belly of machines. Even when you crawled back into trenches, the stink followed, mingling with the odours of mould and sweat until you could no longer tell where you ended and the war began. Sleeping in steel wasn't rest. It wasn't even shelter in the true sense. It was another compromise, another gamble. You told yourself you were safer inside, away from the open sky, but you knew the truth. If a shell landed close, steel turned into a coffin fast as an earth. Shrapnel ricocheted inside, fire spread in seconds, fumes suffocated before you could crawl out. You knew it, felt it every time you slid into a tank or truck. Every time you pressed your face against a greasy wall and tried to drift off. But exhaustion didn't care. Exhaustion dragged you down, even if you knew you might never wake inside the iron bed. And so you took it. The steel bedrooms, the rattling rides, the stink of oil and exhaust. You folded yourself into spaces that weren't meant for bodies, into machines that weren't meant for rest, and you let exhaustion have its way. 'Cause out here, you learn to sleep anywhere, in anything, on anything. Steel was no worse than dirt. It was just different. A different coffin, a different misery, a different reminder that rest on the Eastern Front was never truly rest at all. The cold didn't care about your rank, your age, or how tough you thought you were. The cold stripped everything away until you were nothing but another shivering body, desperate for heat. Out here, there weren't enough blankets, not enough coats, not enough fires. So you turned to the only thing left, each other. Human bodies became furnaces, and the men who fought side by side in the day ended up pressed against each other like sardines at night, not out of affection, not out of choice, but out of pure survival. The first time you did it, it felt strange. You weren't supposed to be this close. Soldiers joked and cursed, but they valued space, the tiny shred of privacy that trenches didn't allow. Sleeping shoulder to shoulder, chest to back, arm draped over another man's waist. It felt wrong at first, awkward and humiliating. But then the wind blew harder, your teeth rattled, and your body shook so badly you thought your bones might snap. That was when you understood. Heat wasn't just comfort. Heat was life. And the only way to keep it was to share it. So you packed in tight. 3, 4, sometimes 5 men pressed together under one thin blanket, if a blanket existed at all. You lined up like logs, each man's chest against the back of the one in front, breath warming the nape of a neck, boots tangling with legs. You pulled coats over all of you, tucking the edges in, trying to seal the heat like a furnace. Your breath condensed instantly, filling the little pocket of air with damp, icy fog. You coughed in each other's faces, muttered curses at elbows and ribs, but no one pulled away. Pulling away meant freezing. The smell was overwhelming. Damp wool, sweat, mould, unwashed bodies, multiplied by however many men were crammed into the space. You breathed it in, tried not to gag, tried to ignore the lice crawling freely from one body to the next. But after a while, you didn't care. You closed your eyes, pressed closer, and let the warmth take over. Because warmth was worth more than dignity. There was no good position. You shifted constantly, searching for comfort that didn't exist. One moment your arm went numb under another man's head. The next your leg cramped from being twisted under someone's thigh. You tried lying on your back, but there was no room. So you rolled to your side, bumping into someone else doing the same. The whole group shifted together, like fish in a net, flopping into new arrangements, none of them better than the last. Sometimes you ended up face to face with another man, breath mingling, noses almost touching. You felt his breath on your lips, hot and sour, smelled the rot of his teeth, the tobacco in his lungs. You didn't pull away. You couldn't. You just closed your eyes and pretended you were somewhere else, while your mind drifted between exhaustion and disgust. Other times you woke with an arm thrown across your chest, a hand gripping your coat like a child holding a toy. You didn't shove it off. You let it stay because the hand was warm, and that was enough. The nights dragged on endlessly, broken only by coughing, shifting, muttered dreams. When one man shivered, the whole group shivered. When one man moved, everyone moved. It was like sleeping inside a single giant organism, 20 legs kicking, 20 arms twitching, 20 lungs breathing in unison. You hated it, but you also depended on it, so alone you'd freeze, together you lasted the night. Sometimes it wasn't even in a trench or a dugout. Sometimes it was in an open field, snow all around, nothing but stars above. You dug a shallow pit, lay down shoulder to shoulder, and pulled coats over the top of the group like a single blanket. Snow drifted down on you, sealing you in, and you felt the weight pressing onto your chest. It was suffocating, but it was warmer than lying exposed. You listened to the muffled sound of wind above, felt the snowpack tighter with each gust, and wondered if you'd dig your way out in the morning, or if you'd be found frozen together, one human bundle under a crust of ice. The sardines' sleep wasn't just about warmth. It was about rationing space. Dugouts weren't big enough for everyone to stretch out. Trucks weren't big enough for everyone to lie flat. So you packed in, stacked sometimes too deep, men lying at opposite angles, feet pressed against faces, helmets digging into ribs, You told yourself you'd rest, but really you just endured another form of discomfort. Your body never forgot it. Even when you moved, the phantom pressure of someone else leaning against you lingered, as if you were permanently moulded into the shape of a sardine. Arguments broke out. Who got the middle? Who was stuck on the edge, half exposed to the draft sneaking under the blanket? The middle was warmest, the edge coldest. Men fought for position, sometimes bitterly, sometimes with fists. But in the end, the edge rotated. No one lasted long on the outside. After an hour of shivering, you elbowed your way inward, and someone else was pushed to the edge, teeth chattering, muttering curses. It was unspoken, but everyone knew. The middle was survival. The edge was suffering. The body heat worked, but it came with a cost. You woke drenched in sweat, your shirt plastered to your back, your trousers soaked. The heat trapped by all those bodies turned into steam, filling the little pocket of air until it dripped down the walls of the dugout. Then morning came, and the cold returned, freezing the sweat against your skin. You staggered out into the light, clothes stiff as boards, colder than before you had gone to sleep. You asked yourself if the warmth was worth it, but the man who'd slept alone, curled in the corner, was stiff and pale by morning, his body frozen hard. That was your answer? You even shared lice this way? The scratching was louder, more desperate as the insects crawled from one seam to another, biting fresh skin each night. Fleas bounced between bodies, rats crept across the line, nibbling at boots, chewing through packs. You all cursed, slapped, scratched, but you didn't move apart. You couldn't. The vermin came with the warmth, part of the deal. You remembered home, where sharing a bed meant comfort, family, maybe even love. Here, it was just survival. The men beside you weren't brothers in arms anymore. They were human radiators, flesh pressed against flesh, keeping you alive whether they liked it or not. You didn't thank them. You didn't even speak about it in the morning. You just pulled away, stretched stiff limbs, scratched at bites, and went back to war, waiting for night to force you together again. There was no dignity left. You pissed in the same corner, farted into the same blanket, coughed into each other's faces, and none of it mattered. Warmth was the only currency, and you paid for it with every shred of privacy. You lay there, eyes half open, surrounded by bodies, and thought of real beds, with space enough to stretch, with blankets thick enough to smother. That dream became your lullaby. You closed your eyes, ignored the elbow in your ribs, and let exhaustion drag you down. Because that was the truth. The war didn't let you sleep like a man. It made you sleep like an animal, packed tight with the herd, pressed together for survival, stripped of dignity, stripped of choice. And in the morning you rose, stiff and filthy, shaking off the memory of warmth, already knowing that tonight you'd crawl back into the same sardine can, because the alternative wasn't discomfort. The alternative was death. When exhaustion finally won, when your body shut down despite the cold, despite the lice, despite the smell of unwashed men pressed together like sacks of meat, you drifted into something that barely resembled sleep. It wasn't deep. It wasn't peaceful. It was a fragile, trembling thing, like trying to rest on thin glass, knowing it would shatter the moment anything touched it. And it always shattered, because out here there was no such thing as silence. The first interruption came from the artillery. Distant at first, a low rumble rolling across the horizon, the kind of sound you told yourself you could ignore. Your eyes flickered open, your ears twitched, but your body begged you to stay still. You tried, but the rumble grew into cracks, then into thunderclaps, shells pounding into the earth with a rhythm that shook the ground beneath your bed of mud or steel. Each explosion thudded into your chest, jolting you awake, filling your nose with dust and the faint tang of cordite drifting on the wind. Sometimes it stayed distant, just a reminder that the front was alive, that men were dying somewhere else. Other times it came closer, creeping toward you like a storm, each blast louder than the last, until you were certain the next one would land in your dugout. You curled tighter, hands over your helmet, heart hammering, waiting for the sound that meant your turn had come. Sleep vanished, replaced by pounding adrenaline that kept your eyes wide until dawn. And when the barrage finally stopped, the silence was worse. You lay there, waiting for the next shell, twitching at every creak and groan, your nerves strung so tight you felt like they'd snap. When it wasn't artillery, it was small arms. A crack in the dark, then another, then a whole burst rattling across the night. Someone thought they saw movement. Someone fired first. Then the whole line lit up, rifles and machine guns spitting fire into the blackness. You jerked upright, fumbling for your weapon, your heart slamming against your ribs, eyes searching for shadows that weren't there. Tracers arced overhead, red and green streaks tearing across the sky like angry fireworks. Orders barked, curses shouted, and you huddled lower, waiting for the chaos to die down. By the time it did, your body was shaking too hard to sleep again. Then there were the raids. The Soviets were clever. They knew the nights were when exhaustion set in, when guards blinked too long, when men slumped in their posts. They crept close under cover of snow, muffled boots crunching softly, until they were right on top of you. Sometimes it was grenades tossed into trenches, the sudden thunder and flash blasting men awake, tearing bodies apart before they even sat up. Sometimes it was knives and bayonets, silent figures lunging out of the dark, cutting throats before anyone could scream. You woke to shouts, to the sound of steel on steel, to the sickening wet noise of blade in flesh. You grabbed your rifle, half blind, swinging it wildly in the blackness, hoping you hit an enemy and not the man who'd slept beside you. The screams stayed with you, high-pitched, desperate, cut short in the middle, or trailing off into gurgles. You knew the voices? They belonged to men you'd spoken to hours before, men who'd shared your blanket, men who'd scratched lice at your side. Hearing them torn apart in the dark tore at you more than shells ever did. Artillery was random, faceless. Screams were personal. They reminded you that the line between alive and dead was nothing but seconds and luck. And then there was the worst interruption of all, silence breaking into madness. Sometimes you woke to nothing. No artillery, no gunfire, no shouting. Just a single noise. A man crying softly in the corner of the dugout, head buried in his hands. A soldier muttering prayers under his breath, over and over, rocking back and forth. Someone laughing, not the kind of laugh that comes from humour, but the brittle, cracked laugh of a mind fraying in the dark. You tried to ignore it, tried to close your eyes, but the sound cut deeper than explosions. It reminded you that the war wasn't just outside. It was inside too, clawing at men until they broke apart quietly in the night. Even animals made their mark. Horses screaming when shells found them. The sound so human it turned your stomach. Dogs howling in villages. Their cries carried on the wind until it felt like they were right outside your trench. Rats squealing as they fought, a chorus of shrieks that mingled with human voices until you couldn't tell the difference anymore. You lay there, eyes wide, every hair on your body standing on end, and you realised the night belonged to noise. There was no peace. There was only waiting for the next sound to tear into you. Sleep became something you snatched in fragments. 10 minutes here, half an hour there. Your body collapsed whenever it could, shutting down mid-sentence, mid-bite, mid-thought. You woke just as quickly, jolted upright by the next blast, the next shout, the next scream. Your dreams bled into reality, mixing with the noise until you couldn't tell if the shelling had been real or imagined. You asked the men beside you, but they didn't know either. You laughed bitterly together, then scratched at your seams, pulled your coat tighter, and waited for another night to pass. And the worst part was knowing tomorrow would be the same. Sleep wasn't rest. Sleep was interruption. Sleep was fear. Sleep was a fragile truce with exhaustion that shattered every time the night reminded you that war never really stopped. You lay down in mud, in snow, in steel, in the stink of bodies pressed together, and you prayed for just an hour of silence. But silence never lasted. Silence always broke, and when it did, it broke you too. If artillery kept you awake and raids tore you out of fragile dreams, then the sky itself became another kind of enemy. You didn't see it during the day as much. Daylight brought enough chaos on the ground, but at night, when you tried to fold yourself into a trench, a dugout, or even the back of a truck, the sky began to hum. That sound came first, faint at the edges of hearing, like bees somewhere above the clouds. You froze, listening, hoping you were wrong, but the hum always grew louder, deeper, until it vibrated in your ribs. That was when you knew. Sleep wasn't coming tonight. Bombers didn't care that you were exhausted. They didn't care that you'd marched 20 miles, dug trenches until your hands blistered, or shivered all night in wet wool. To them, you were just coordinates, just a place on a map where explosives would fall. You could hear them long before you saw them. That steady drone in the sky was worse than silence, worse than artillery because it was waiting. You never knew when the bombs would fall, or where. All you knew was that they would. The sound turned into rhythm, engines beating like a monstrous heart above you. You pressed yourself into the dirt, helmet tight against your skull, coat wrapped around you as if wool could protect you from steel. Men whispered in the dark, muttered prayers, clutched rifles they couldn't use against airplanes. You closed your eyes, wishing the noise would fade, but it never did. It swelled until it filled your whole body, until every nerve screamed for release. And then it came, the whistle. That thin, rising sound, sharp enough to slice the air. A split second of recognition before the earth buckled under you, before the night turned white with fire and dust. The dugout shook, boards rattling, dirt raining down from the ceiling, the air filled with choking powder. You gasped for breath, coughing, ears ringing so loudly you couldn't even hear your own voice. Another whistle followed, then another, then the steady thunder of bombs falling one after another, each one hammering the earth, each one threatening to bury you alive. Sleep vanished. Even exhaustion vanished. Your body ran on fear, heart pounding so hard you thought it might crack your ribs. You pressed your face into the mud, fists clenched, every muscle waiting for the one bomb meant for you. You didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't dare look up. Around you, men cursed, cried out, shouted for their mothers, shouted for God. No one could hear each other over the roar. The ground itself felt alive, shaking, heaving, as if trying to throw you off. You wondered if the sky would ever stop tearing itself apart. When the bombs finally ended, silence didn't bring relief. It brought ringing ears, heaving lungs, and the smell of burning. You staggered upright, eyes stinging, nose filled with smoke and dust. Fires burned in the distance, black columns twisting into the sky, turning the horizon red. Houses flattened, wagons shredded, trenches collapsed. Sometimes entire dugouts caved in, and the men inside stayed buried. You saw their boots sticking out of the ground, toes pointing at the stars. You didn't dig them out. You couldn't. There was no time and no strength. You just turned away, knowing you'd be back in the same hole tomorrow, waiting for the next raid. Even when the bombers didn't drop their loads on your exact position, the noise alone was enough to ruin you. The drone of engines kept you awake, hour after hour, circling, always circling. You flinched at every change in pitch, waiting for the whistle. Sometimes they passed without dropping anything, just teasing you with the threat, keeping you awake until dawn with your nerves afraid raw. You hated them for that, almost more than for the bombs. Explosions at least ended quickly. The waiting never did. Some nights they used incendiaries. Those were worse than explosives. You saw whole villages go up in flames, thatched roofs blazing like torches, barns collapsing in sparks. The night turned to day in flickering orange. You lay in your trench, watching the glow spread across the horizon, smoke rolling into the sky, so thick it choked the stars. The fire ate everything: wood, straw, food stores, animals. It burned until nothing was left but black skeletons of houses and the faint smell of roasted flesh. And you knew that tomorrow you'd march through the ruins, scavenging what you could, stepping over the bodies of those caught inside. The worst were the night bombers, the ones the Soviets sent in cheap wooden planes, rattling across the sky like toys. You called them sewing machines because of the stuttering sound of their engines, but there was nothing funny about them. They flew low, slow, dropping bombs without pattern, sometimes single sticks of dynamite shoved out by hand. They never hit much, but they never let you sleep. You lay there in the mud, listening to that droning buzz above, waiting for the sudden crack, the sudden whistle, the sudden spray of dirt. Even if they missed by miles, your heart never slowed until the sound faded. By then, the night was already half gone, and sleep was lost with it. You tried to adapt. You told yourself you'd get used to the noise, that you'd learn to sleep through it the way you learned to sleep through coughing, through scratching, through rats crawling across your chest. But the sky was different. The sky promised death at random. You couldn't close your eyes with engines above. You couldn't let go when you knew bombs could drop at any second. So you stayed awake, shivering, scratching, staring at the black canopy above, waiting for the next flare, the next whistle, the next crash. When you did drift off, dreams were worse. The bombs followed you there, explosions shaking your mind even in sleep. You woke gasping, heart pounding, the sound of whistles still ringing in your ears. Sometimes you screamed, loud enough to wake the others, earning curses and elbows. But they understood. They'd done the same. Everyone had. The sky was in your head now, just as much as it was above your trench. Even the silence after raids wasn't real silence. It was too heavy, too thick, filled with the echo of engines that weren't there anymore. You lay still, ears straining, convinced you still heard them droning in the distance. It was a phantom hum, a trick of nerves stretched too far, but it kept you awake anyway. You could never escape the sound. It followed you everywhere. That was the truth of it. Sleep wasn't just stolen by the ground, by the lice, by the rats, by the cold. It was stolen by the sky itself. The heavens had turned into another battlefield, and every night you lay helpless under it, waiting for death to fall out of the darkness. You didn't fight it. You couldn't. You just endured it, night after night, praying for a stretch of quiet sky that never came. You never realised how much you needed a pillow until you didn't have one anymore. Back home, it was just there, waiting for you at the end of the day. Soft, familiar, something you could bury your head in and forget the world. Out here, the front stripped that luxury away like it stripped away everything else. You didn't lie down on cushions. You dropped your head on whatever was closest. Comfort wasn't the goal anymore. Survival was. And even the act of resting your head became another kind of misery. The most obvious substitute was your helmet. It was always there, heavy and dented, strapped to your body from dawn until dusk. When the day finally ended, you pulled it off and set it beside you, then tipped it on its side and dropped your head onto the rim. Steel against bone. Cold, unyielding. A curved surface that never matched the shape of your skull. You woke up with a line pressed deep into your forehead, your neck stiff, your scalp numb from the metal, leeching away what little warmth you had left. The inside stank of sweat and grease, your own scalp oils baked into the lining, and pressing your face into it made you gag more than once. But it was still better than the mud. Sometimes you turned the helmet upside down, resting the crown on the ground, and letting the edge form a shallow bowl for your skull. That worked until the edge dug into your ear, leaving it throbbing for hours. Other times you stuffed straw into it, trying to cushion the steel, but the straw was always damp, and before long the whole thing reeked of mildew. Still, you used it, because at least it lifted your head a few inches off the dirt, and that was enough to trick your body into thinking you'd done something to help yourself. When you couldn't stand the helmet anymore, you tried your bread bag. It was always close, slung across your shoulder, stuffed with whatever pitiful rations you'd managed to hold onto. Hard biscuits, a lump of bread, maybe a tin of meat or a scrap of paper. You slid it under your head, used it like a pillow, and told yourself it was better than steel. Sometimes it was. The cloth was softer, at least at first, and the shape was easier on your neck. But you paid for it in other ways. The biscuits turned to dust, the bread to crumbs, crushed into powder under the weight of your skull. In the morning you shook it out and ate it anyway, dirt and all, because you couldn't waste food. Your pillow doubled as your pantry, and every night you had to choose whether to protect your food or your neck. Frozen packs were the worst, and yet you used them all the time. Your rucksack, stiff with frost, straps hard as boards, became your only cushion when you collapsed into the trench. You lay your head against it, felt the buckles dig into your temple, the edges cut into your neck. The whole thing was frozen solid, like resting on a block of ice. You winced, shifted, tried a new angle, then gave up and let exhaustion drag you down anyway. Sometimes you tucked it under your coat to soften it, but that only made your chest ache. And no matter what, you woke with a stiff neck, shoulders aching, head pounding as if you'd been beaten with a stick. When none of those worked, you improvised. You folded your greatcoat into a bundle, shoved it under your head, and hoped it held its shape. It didn't. The wool was too heavy, the fold slipped apart, and within minutes your head was back on the ground, chin pressed to your chest. You used boots, turning them sideways, lacing them together, stuffing them with straw to form a makeshift cushion. That worked until the stench of your own sweat and rot hit your nose, until you woke gagging from the smell of your own feet. Some men used each other. They leaned on shoulders, rested heads on arms, used another man's thigh as a cushion. It wasn't comfortable, but it was warm, and warmth always mattered more. You woke when the other man shifted, muttered curses as your head hit the ground, then shoved yourself back into place and started over. No one complained. Everyone needed something, and if that something was another man's body, so be it. There was no standard. No one had the same solution. One night you used your pack, the next your helmet, the next a bundle of rags scavenged from a ruined house. Sometimes you lay flat with nothing at all, your cheek pressed into mud or frozen dirt, telling yourself that was easier than fighting with straps and buckles. You convinced yourself it didn't matter, that you were too tired to care. But in the morning, your neck screamed at you, your head throbbed, and you realised just how much a pillow mattered. The absurdity of it became routine. You saw men arranging straw like cushions, shaping little mounds in the mud, fussing over them like children with toys. You saw helmets stuffed with rags, packs tied tight into lumps, boots lined up in pairs to form a flat surface. Everyone had a trick, a method, a ritual, but none of it worked. Comfort never came. The only thing that changed was the angle of your misery. And still, you kept trying. Night after night, you reached for something, anything, to put between your head and the ground. Because no matter how filthy, how stiff, how frozen, it felt wrong to just drop your skull onto the dirt. A pillow, even the worst kind, gave you the illusion of normalcy. It reminded you that you were human, not just an animal curled in a hole. It reminded you that sleep, however broken, was supposed to be more than shivering in the mud. You laughed about it sometimes. Men joked that their bread bags were the finest goose-down pillows, that their helmets had been designed by luxury craftsmen, that their packs were softer than the beds of kings. The laughter was bitter, but it was laughter all the same. Humour was the only way to swallow the reality that you were resting your head on steel, on crumbs, on frozen leather, night after night. But when the laughter faded, when the cold pressed back in, when the lice bit harder and the rats scuttled across your boots, you felt the truth again. There were no pillows here. There was no rest. Just helmets, bread bags and frozen packs. The mockery of comfort in a place that stripped comfort away. You closed your eyes, shifted your aching neck, and let exhaustion take you, knowing you'd wake sore, stiff, and just as tired as when you'd lain down. When you thought about hospitals before the war, you imagined clean sheets, the sharp smell of antiseptic, soft voices, and a real mattress under your back. Out here that picture was a cruel joke. The field hospitals weren't havens. They weren't places of rest. They were extensions of the front, just dirtier, louder, and somehow colder. And the so-called beds waiting for you there weren't beds at all. They were planks. Hard, unyielding, splintered boards nailed together in a hurry, lined up in long rows inside drafty barns, half-collapsed schoolhouses, or canvas tents that flapped in the wind. When you collapsed onto one, it wasn't relief that hit you. It was pain. Your back slammed against wood, every bone feeling the impact. The planks creaked, sagged in the middle, pressed ridges into your shoulders, hips and spine. If you were lucky, there was a thin layer of straw between you and the boards, but the straw was always damp, riddled with lice, smelling of mould and piss. It stuck to your uniform, clung to your wounds, scratched at your skin until you wished you'd stayed on the ground outside. The buildings used as hospitals were never meant for healing. They were barns with holes in the walls, schools with shattered windows, village halls stripped bare of furniture. The wind howled through gaps. Snow blew inside. Dust fell from rafters with every explosion. You lay on your plank bed, shivering, listening to the canvas flap or the rafters groan, and you told yourself this was still better than the trench. But it wasn't. The cold came inside anyway. The boards were colder than the earth, soaking heat from your body until your teeth chattered and your fingers turned blue. The smell hit you hardest. A mix of blood, sweat and disinfectant, so weak it barely covered anything. Piss buckets overturned in corners, the stench of gangrene crawling through the air, men groaning and coughing all around you. It stuck to your throat, coated your tongue, filled your nose until you couldn't taste anything but rot. You turned your head into your sleeve, pressed your face against damp wool, but it didn't help. The boards under you carried the same smell, soaked into them from the bodies that had lain there before. Rest was impossible. Men screamed beside you, their wounds raw, their fevers boiling. Some called for mothers, some begged for water, some whimpered like children. Others went quiet, too quiet, slipping away in the night without anyone noticing until morning. You tried to close your eyes, but every sound carved its way in. The saw of a bone being cut, the hiss of a hot iron sealing a wound, the gurgle of blood in a throat that couldn't clear it. You pressed your hands over your ears, curled on your side against the boards, and begged for sleep that never came. And even if it did come, the boards reminded you weren't safe. They sagged under too much weight, cracked suddenly in the night, sending splinters into your skin. You shifted constantly, searching for a softer spot, finding none. Your body ached from lying still, but moving brought new pain, new splinters, new stiffness. You envied the dead sometimes, not for their peace, but because at least they didn't have to lie on these boards anymore. The worst part was knowing you weren't there to heal. Field hospitals weren't about comfort. They were about patching you up just enough to send you back out. A bandage here, a stitch there, maybe a few hours on the boards before you were shoved onto your feet again, rifle back in your hands. If you were truly broken, leg shattered, arm gone, frostbite creeping black up your feet, then maybe you stayed longer. But longer meant worse. Longer meant infection spreading, rot setting in, your bedmates moaning until they went silent. You stared at the ceiling beams above, counted the cracks in the wood, and wondered how many men had died on your plank before you. Some didn't even get the boards. When space ran out, you were laid on the floor, straw scattered in heaps, men piled side by side in rows, rats scuttled between them, nibbling crumbs from pockets, sometimes nibbling more when the men were too weak to move. You swatted at them, cursed, tried to kick them away, but they always came back. The straw rustled with lice, the floor slick with blood and piss, and the boards above you groaned under the weight of men just as miserable. The medics did what they could, but what they could was never enough. Bandages were reused until they stiffened with dried blood. Instruments were wiped on rags, barely clean, then pressed into fresh wounds. Bottles of morphine were too rare to waste, so most men endured amputations awake, teeth clamped on belts, boards rattling under their convulsions. You listened to the saw cut through bone, felt your stomach turn, and prayed your turn never came. Sleep after that sound was impossible. It rang in your ears long after the scream stopped. Even the boards themselves became weapons against you. Splinters dug deep, turned to infections when you scratched them open. The planks warped with damp, sagged under bodies until they snapped, dropping you onto the straw below. Nails jutted out, catching clothes, tearing skin. You cursed the wood, hated it, but still lay on it, because there was nowhere else to go. The hospitals weren't quiet at night. You thought they might be, that exhaustion would silence everyone, but it was worse after dark. Fever made men babble nonsense, shouting words in delirium, crying out for people who weren't there. The groans never stopped, the coughs rattled endlessly, the smell grew stronger. You tossed on your boards, pressed your face into your pack, tried to pretend you were anywhere else, but every noise, every smell, every ache dragged you back. And when you did drift into half-sleep, dreams were no kinder. You dreamed of clean beds, of white sheets, of soft pillows, only to wake with your cheek stuck to rough wood, your back stiff, your body screaming. The contrast crushed you more than the boards themselves. Dreams gave you hope for seconds, then tore it away with reality. You stopped wanting them. Sometimes you preferred staying awake, staring at the rafters, counting the seconds until dawn. That was the reality of the boards. They weren't rest. They weren't healing. They were just another form of punishment, another reminder that the war had stripped away even the smallest kindness. You didn't lie on them because they were beds. You lay on them because you had no choice. And you rose from them just as tired, just as broken as when you'd collapsed. The boards didn't heal. They just kept you alive long enough to suffer again. Winter wasn't just a season on the Eastern Front. It was a weapon, and it was more merciless than bullets, more patient than artillery, more thorough than hunger. You learned that the first time you were sent out on a campaign in January, when the snow stretched to the horizon in every direction, and the air cut into your lungs with every breath like shards of glass. You thought you knew cold. You didn't. Not until you marched through snow that swallowed your boots, through winds that howled without stopping, through nights where the ground itself felt alive with frost. And all the while, there was one sound that followed you. No matter how many miles you marched or how many hours you tried to sleep, the rattling staccato of teeth clattering together. It started in the evening, when the sun dipped low and the temperature dropped faster than you thought possible. You wrapped yourself in your coat, pulled the collar high, shoved your hands into your armpits, but it didn't matter. The chill crept in anyway. First your fingers stiffened, then your toes, then the ache settled in your jaw. You clenched your teeth to stop them from chattering, biting down until your head throbbed, but you couldn't hold it forever. Eventually your jaw shook loose, your teeth knocked together, and the sound echoed in your skull. You looked around and realized every man around you was doing the same. 1,000 tiny rhythms, 1,000 jaws rattling in unison, a miserable orchestra that played through the night. The marches made it worse. Hours of trudging through waist-deep snow, every step sucking at your legs, every breath freezing in your throat. You moved like machines, boots crunching, rifles slung across aching shoulders, eyes half closed against the wind. Talking wasn't possible. Your lips were too stiff, your tongues too numb. The only sounds were boots crunching and teeth chattering, a syncopated beat that went on for miles. You hated it. You hated hearing your own body betray you. Hated listening to the same sound from everyone else. Hated knowing that no one could stop it. The rhythm followed you like a drum, reminding you that the cold was always winning. At night, when you tried to rest, the noise was unbearable. You curled in a trench, bodies pressed together, blankets pulled tight, and still the chattering filled the air. You couldn't escape it. Men on either side shook so hard their jaws clattered against their skulls, the sound magnified in the stillness. Some tried to laugh about it, joked that they were a chorus, that the teeth were playing songs only winter could hear. The laughter cracked quickly, broken by more chattering, more groaning, more curses muttered through numb lips. No one really found it funny. You tried tricks to stop it. Pressed your hands against your jaw, bit down on straps, on rags, even on the barrel of your rifle, anything to keep your teeth from clicking. Some men stuffed paper in their mouths, chewed cloth, pressed sticks between molars. It didn't matter. The cold always found a way. Your jaw shook, your muscles spasmed, and your body played its own miserable music, whether you wanted it to or not. The sound wasn't just noise. It was a reminder of weakness. Officers cursed you for it, shouted at men to stop rattling their teeth, said it gave away positions at night, as if anyone could just will it away. You clenched your mouth shut until your temples ached, forced your lips tight, but the moment you loosened, the sound came back. Some were beaten for it, struck across the face for making too much noise. They tried harder after that, but no one succeeded for long. The chattering was stronger than discipline, stronger than pride. It was survival, the body's last pathetic attempt to generate heat. Sometimes the chattering turned violent. Your jaw clenched so hard you felt teeth crack, enamel splintering under the pressure. You spit blood into the snow, pressed your hand to your mouth, and knew you had broken something. But you couldn't stop. The spasms continued, jaw locking and unlocking until every tooth ached. Men lost fillings, lost teeth entirely, shattered molars in the middle of the night, just from trying to stay alive. The pain blended with the cold until you couldn't tell which was worse. The sound carried far. You swore the Soviets could hear it across the lines, the chorus of German teeth rattling in trenches like a signal. It echoed in dugouts, magnified in narrow spaces, bouncing off walls until it seemed the whole room vibrated with it. You woke in the dark, ears ringing, convinced the noise wasn't coming from outside, but from inside your skull. Sometimes it felt like the war wasn't fought with guns at all, but with teeth grinding endlessly until they broke. There were nights when the noise was joined by screams, when frostbite took hold and men woke howling as their toes blackened, as their fingers swelled, as the cold gnawed deeper than chattering jaws could fight. The screams were short, ragged, cut off quickly, but they layered over the rattling rhythm until the whole trench felt alive with misery. You pressed your hands to your ears, tried to shut it out, but your own jaw betrayed you. clicking and knocking until you added to the sound you hated most. You thought you'd grow used to it. You thought that after weeks, months, campaigns, the noise would fade into the background. Just another part of life at the front. But you never did. Every night it came back. Every march it followed you. Every rest was broken by the sound of men's teeth grinding together in endless, helpless rhythm. You hated it more than the cold itself. The cold was silence. The chattering was its voice, constant, mocking, reminding you with every knock that you would never be warm again. And still, you endured. You clenched, you cursed, you bit down until your jaw ached, but the sound always returned. It was the music of winter, the soundtrack of campaigns fought not with bullets, but with breath turning to ice, with jaws locked in misery, with teeth rattling like dice in a cup. You didn't fight it anymore. You just listened, let it wash over you. Let it fill your head until sleep came despite it. And in the morning, when you rose stiff and frozen, the rhythm stayed with you, echoing in your skull, reminding you that the next night would sound exactly the same. Sometimes, the only thing that broke the rhythm of the cold, the lice, the coughing, and the teeth rattling was paper. Thin, fragile, smudged paper that had somehow survived a journey from another world to yours. A letter from home was more than words. It was warmth that didn't come from fire, a kind of blanket you pulled over your mind instead of your body. You unfolded it slowly, carefully, hands shaking not just from the frost, but from something else, something softer. The ritual mattered. You didn't just tear a letter open. You handled it like treasure, smoothing the creases, holding it close to your chest for a moment before daring to read. Some men sniffed the paper, searching for the faintest trace of perfume, of laundry soap, of a kitchen far away. Sometimes the scent was really there, lingering in the fibres. Sometimes it was only in your imagination. But you breathed deep anyway, convincing yourself you could smell bread baking, fields in summer, the faint powder from your wife's hands. For a moment, the dugout disappeared. Reading wasn't easy. Your hands trembled, the candlelight flickered, and the words blurred against the page. The wax stub sat in a bottle or jam tin, guttering in the draught, its flame weak and yellow. The shadows stretched long across the walls, bending the faces of men who watched you silently, waiting their turn. You hunched over, shielding the flame with your palm, eyes straining to catch each line before the candle sputtered out. Sometimes the letters arrived water-stained, edges blackened from smoke, ink smeared into blotches. You read anyway, filling in the missing words with guesses, hearing voices in your head to patch the gaps. The words themselves didn't matter as much as the act of reading them. A wife writing about chores, a mother writing about weather, a sister talking about neighbours. Ordinary things turned holy out here. A sentence about washing clothes or a note about a garden felt like poetry. A reminder that life still existed somewhere beyond mud and snow. You clung to every word, rolling them over in your mind, repeating them under your breath. Some men memorized whole letters, reciting them quietly before sleep, like prayers. But the letters also hurt. They reminded you of what you'd lost. A wife asking if you were eating well. A mother telling you she worried about the cold. Children drawing pictures in the margins. Each line tore at you because you knew they couldn't imagine this world. They pictured you sitting by a stove, safe, fed, wrapped in a greatcoat. They didn't know you were scratching lice, gnawing on frozen bread, curled in a trench under a blanket stiff with ice. You wanted to tell them, but you couldn't. Censors cut anything too grim, and even if they hadn't, you didn't want to pour this misery onto the page. So you wrote back with lies. I am well. The winter is hard, but we are managing. I think of you always. The truth stayed in the mud with you. Not every man got letters. Some never received a single one, month after month, year after year. They watched others unfold papers, watched faces soften in candlelight, watched tears run down cheeks, and they sat in silence, pretending not to care. They borrowed other men's words, asked what their letters said, clung to scraps of news as if it belonged to them too. But it wasn't the same. Without letters, the front swallowed you whole. The world back home became vague, blurry, fading with each day, until you weren't sure it had ever been real. Letters were hoarded like gold. Men carried them in breast pockets, folded and unfolded until the paper thinned, the edges tore, the ink smudged away. They slept with them pressed to their chests, close to their hearts, as if proximity could protect them from the cold. Some read them aloud, sharing the words with the whole dugout, voices breaking as they stumbled through lines about harvests and holidays. Others read silently, holding the words close, eyes darting back and forth like men afraid of being caught. The candlelight made everything more fragile. The flame bent and swayed, threatening to snuff out with every gust of wind, every cough from the man beside you. You leaned closer, desperate to catch every word before darkness returned. Sometimes the candle burned down to nothing, leaving you clutching a letter in the blackness, unable to finish. You lay there, eyes closed, whispering the parts you remembered, filling in the rest with imagination. And imagination was both salvation and torment. You pictured the handwriting belonging to your wife's hand, moving across paper in a kitchen warm with fire. You pictured your mother at a table, her back bent, her lips pursed as she thought of what to say. You pictured your children's voices, their laughter, their questions. But then the contrast hit you. You opened your eyes and saw mud walls, frozen beams, lice crawling on cuffs, men coughing blood into rags. The letters gave you hope, but they also reminded you how far gone you were. Some men cried openly, tears streaking through grime, dripping onto paper until the ink bled. No one mocked them. Everyone understood. A letter could shatter even the hardest man. It wasn't weakness, it was memory, and memory was unbearable when the present was this bleak. There were nights when the letters didn't soothe you at all, nights when the words were too sharp, too painful. A wife mentioning another man's help with chores, a mother writing of neighbours gone to funerals, news of shortages, of bombing raids, of family members sick. You lay in your trench, letter crumpled in your fist, staring at the ceiling while bitterness clawed at your chest. Instead of comfort, the words brought rage, despair, jealousy of the world you couldn't touch anymore. Some men tore letters apart, stuffed them into the stove or the snow, swore they'd rather hear nothing at all. By morning they regretted it, but it didn't matter. The paper was gone. Even so, most held on to their letters until they disintegrated. They read them until the folds wore through, until the pages split, until the words became faint shadows. Then they carried them still, scraps of paper tucked into wallets, pinned inside coats, pressed between layers of damp fabric. The letters rotted with the uniforms, but no one let them go. A letter, even unreadable, was still proof that home existed. When the candlelight finally died, when the wax burned down to the last drop, you folded a letter one last time and slipped it back into your pocket. You lay back, closed your eyes, and felt the paper against your chest, a thin barrier between you and the cold. It wasn't enough to warm you, not physically, but sometimes it was enough to keep you from breaking completely. And out here, that was as close to sleep as you ever got. Sleep never really came easy out there, and when it did, it wasn't the kind of sleep that healed. It was the collapse of a body too far gone, shutting itself down in fragments, dragging the mind with it whether you wanted to rest or not. Add the cold, the pain in your fingers, the gnawing ache in your feet, and your brain started playing tricks on you. At first you thought you were dreaming, then you realised you were awake. And after a while, you couldn't tell the difference anymore. It started small. A sound in the distance that wasn't there. Footsteps crunching in the snow when no one was moving. A voice calling your name when the trench was silent. You turned your head, blinking into the dark, and found nothing but mud walls and the faint glow of frost. But the sound lingered, echoing in your skull, convincing you that maybe it had been real. You shook yourself, rubbed your eyes, cursed under your breath, but minutes later it came again. The mind, half dead from exhaustion, created things the body couldn't handle. Frostbite made it worse. First came the numbness, toes fading into nothing, fingers stiffening until they felt carved from wood. Then the pain, sharp, stabbing, as blood tried to move through frozen veins. You stomped your boots, slapped your hands together, but the relief never lasted. The cold ate at you steadily, crawling upward, creeping closer to the core of your body. And somewhere in the middle of it, when the pain blurred into numbness again, your brain gave up and started filling the void with lies. You saw fires that weren't there, flickering flames in the distance, warm glows along the trench wall, even sparks rising from the ground beside you. You reached toward them, desperate, only to clutch at air. The men around you saw them too sometimes, whole groups pointing at the same patch of snow, convinced a fire was burning there. You stumbled forward, ready to thaw your hands, and found only ice, hard and lifeless. The cold made you believe in warmth, even when it didn't exist. Voices were the worst. They came soft at first, whispers carried on the wind, mutters you thought belonged to the man beside you. But when you turned, his eyes were closed, his mouth shut tight, his breath shallow. You leaned closer, listening, and still heard him. Your mother's voice, your wife's, your child's laughter. They spoke your name, called you home, begged you to come inside. You wept sometimes, quietly, knowing it was impossible. Other times you stood up, staggering into the snow, chasing sounds that only lived inside your head. Men vanished that way, wandering into the white until the frost claimed them. The next morning you found their bodies stiff, eyes open, lips still moving as if they had been talking to ghosts. The visions came during marches too. Hours of trudging through snow, head bowed, boots dragging, eyelids heavy. You swore you saw houses in the distance, windows glowing, smoke curling from chimneys. You pushed forward, heart racing, only to watch the buildings dissolve into trees, shadows, mounds of snow. Other times it was people. Whole groups walking alongside you, faces familiar, uniforms crisp, boots unmarked by mud. You blinked and they vanished, leaving only your unit, bent and broken, dragging themselves forward. Exhaustion didn't just tire you. It invented whole worlds for you to stumble through. In dugouts, half asleep, you dreamed with your eyes open. Rats grew into dogs, their shapes shifting in the candlelight. The boards above your head creaked into voices, moaning your name, whispering promises of warmth and food. You closed your eyes tighter, muttered to yourself, tried to drown them out. But the whispers pressed harder, filling the space until you didn't know if you were awake or trapped in a fever dream. Frostbite hallucinations carried a different weight. They came with heat, or what felt like heat. Men stripped off coats, unbuttoned shirts, threw gloves aside, convinced they were burning alive. They smile sometimes, relief in their faces, as if the nightmare was finally over. You shouted at them, begged them to stop, tried to force coats back on, but they fought you off. Their bodies thought the end was warmth, when really it was death. You found them in the snow, bare-chested, lips blue, frozen stiff in poses that looked almost peaceful. Even food became part of the visions. The hunger mixed with exhaustion until you smelled bread baking, heard bacon sizzling, tasted soup on your tongue. You chewed at nothing, swallowed air, and convinced yourself you were full for a moment. Then the taste faded, the smell drifted, and your stomach clawed at itself harder than before. You cursed your own mind for lying to you, but you couldn't stop it. It dangled comfort just out of reach, enough to keep you alive, enough to keep you miserable. You didn't talk about the hallucinations at first. You thought they were shameful, proof you were cracking. But then you heard other men muttering too, saw them chasing ghosts, watched them reach for fires that weren't there. You realised it wasn't just you. It was everyone. The front wasn't just killing bodies. It was unravelling minds, piece by piece, until you couldn't tell what was real. You scratched at lice, blinked at shadows, muttered at voices, and prayed you wouldn't wander into the snow one night, chasing something your head had invented. Sleep didn't fix it. Sleep made it worse. Dreams and hallucinations bled together, one feeding the other. You woke in the trench, heart racing, swearing you'd just eaten, swearing you just held your wife's hand, swearing you just sat by a fire. Then reality slammed back. Cold mud, stiff boots, frozen fingers. You shook your head, cursed, shoved your hands deeper into your coat. The line between real and false grew thinner every night. That was the truth of it. Exhaustion didn't just make you tired. Frostbite didn't just make you numb. Together they turned the world into something twisted. A landscape where fire burned without heat, where voices spoke without mouths, where comfort dangled just out of reach. You lived inside those illusions, carried them with you, let them mock you until the end of winter. And when morning came, when you rose stiff and shivering, you carried the ghosts forward with you, waiting for the next night when they'd come back stronger. Morning wasn't relief. Morning was another punishment. When you opened your eyes, if you managed to sleep at all, there was no sense of renewal, no feeling of being restored. You didn't rise with energy. You dragged yourself upright, stiff, brittle and aching, every bone screaming, every muscle locked tight from cold. The first thought in your head wasn't gratitude for another day. It was dread, because surviving the night didn't mean anything. It only meant you had to go through it all again. The routine was always the same. You blinked against the grey light creeping into the trench or the dugout, the pale glow of a sun that gave no warmth. Your breath fogged in front of you, already proof that the air hadn't changed. You pulled your coat tighter, rubbed your hands together, stomped your boots against the frozen earth. Nothing helped. The cold clung to you like a second skin, heavier now that you'd spent hours lying still. Every joint cracked when you tried to move, and your head pounded from another night of shallow, broken sleep. Around you, men stirred the same way. Coughs filled the air, rough and wet, cutting through the silence. Someone muttered a curse. Someone else groaned as he tried to stand, his legs stiff, his back bent. Faces looked pale, lips cracked, eyes ringed with exhaustion. You didn't need a mirror to know you looked the same. No one looked rested. No one looked alive, not fully. You all just looked less dead than you could have been. The ground bore the marks of the night. Straw damp with sweat and piss. Blankets stiff with frost. Boots frozen solid where they had been left too close to the trench wall. Rats scattered when you moved, their squeaks fading into corners. The smell was thicker now. Mould, smoke, rot, the sour stench of bodies that hadn't survived the dark. Someone always hadn't. In the morning you checked. You nudged the man beside you, waited for breath. If none came, you looked away, muttered a curse under your breath, and moved on. There was no ceremony, no pause. The living kept going. The dead stayed where they were until someone had time to drag them out. Food came next, if you had any. A chunk of bread frozen so hard you had to thaw it in your mouth, gnawing until your jaw ached. A smear of fat if you were lucky. A spoonful of thin soup if supplies had managed to reach you. Most mornings it was nothing at all. Hunger gnawed alongside the cold. A constant second pain that dulled only when exhaustion took its place. You chewed slowly, shared scraps with the man beside you, and pretended it was enough. Then the orders came. Always the orders. Digging, marching, patrolling, fighting. It didn't matter that your body was broken from the night. The war didn't stop because you were tired. The war didn't care that your feet were blistered, that your hands shook, that your mind had been gnawed hollow by hallucinations and dreams. You staggered to your feet, strapped on your pack, slung your rifle, and moved with the rest. Surviving the night only meant being strong enough to suffer in daylight. The cold followed you, biting harder in the early hours. Your boots crunched on frost. Your breath hung in clouds. Your body shook with every step. The sun rose pale and distant, offering nothing but a reminder that the world hadn't ended yet. You trudged forward, head bowed, eyes half closed, teeth chattering all over again. Behind you, in the trench or the dugout, the evidence of another night remained. Bodies stiff, blankets frozen into crust, the faint smoke of candles burned down to nubs. And ahead of you, nothing but the promise of doing it all over again. That was the reality. There was no finish line, no real victory in surviving a night. You didn't get stronger from it. You didn't even get used to it. Each night stripped more away, and each morning forced you to face the fact that it wasn't over. The cycle repeated, grinding you down, body and mind, until you wondered if you wanted to survive the next one at all. Some men didn't. Some simply lay down one evening and didn't rise with the others. Their bodies stayed curled in the dirt, frozen into whatever shape exhaustion had left them in. The living stepped around them because there was no time for mourning. The war demanded more hours, more sweat, more lives. When you did rise, when you did survive, the bitter truth hit you. Survival was meaningless here. Making it through the night was only the ticket to another day of misery. You hadn't won anything. You hadn't gained anything. You had only delayed the end. You carried your rifle, marched into the snow, dug another trench, waited for the next shell, and knew that when darkness came again, you'd be back in the same place, shivering, scratching, curled in misery, praying your body didn't give out before the light returned. And so it went on, night after night, morning after morning. Survival wasn't triumph. Survival was obligation. The only reward for living through one night on the Eastern Front was waking up to face another. And so the nights dragged on, each one bleeding into the next, each one survived only to be repeated again. There was no real rest, no true comfort, only the scraps that men clawed together out of straw, steel, and each other's warmth. Helmets turned into pillows, snow into shelter, bodies pressed together in desperate attempts to keep the cold at bay. Some nights ended with silence, others with screams, and most with the same steady rhythm of teeth rattling in the dark. What it meant, in the end, was simple. Sleep wasn't a gift on the Eastern Front. It was another battle. A battle against cold, against hunger, against the gnawing presence of vermin, against the fear that death would arrive before dawn. A battle that never truly ended, even when the morning came. And if you closed your eyes now, if you let yourself drift into that same kind of broken half-sleep, maybe you'd understand it. The endless weight of exhaustion, the sharp bite of frost, the blur between dreams and waking. Maybe you'd feel, just for a moment, what it meant to try to rest in a place where rest wasn't meant for men at all. So lie back, breathe slowly, let the noise fade, let the cold settle, let your own exhaustion carry you the way it carried them. Not into comfort, not into peace, but into something quieter, something that asks nothing more than surrender. The night is long, and the world outside can wait until morning.